Hello everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I've debated for months whether to share this. Most people wouldn't believe me anyway, but I need to get this off my chest. What happened to us last May near the Mayaka River still gives me nightmares. It was supposed to be a chill camping weekend. Just me, my buddy Mike, his girlfriend Jen, and our friends Sarah and Chris. All of us in our late 20s or early 30s, just wanting to escape the daily grind. We'd found this spot off the beaten path where the woods opened up to this small grassy clearing, perfect for camping, or so we thought. Remote enough to feel like a real getaway, but not so far that it seemed dangerous. We arrived Friday afternoon on May 11th, set up our 3 tents, and spent the evening doing typical camping stuff, grilling burgers, drinking beers, sharing stories around the fire. Nothing fancy. The weather was perfect, warm but not sweltering, with a nice breeze. By midnight, we were all pretty tired and decided to turn in. Mike and Jen took the large tent, Sarah had her own, and Chris and I shared the third one. I remember checking my phone before going to sleep. It was 12:16. I must have dozed off pretty quickly because the next thing I knew, I was jolted awake by what sounded like someone snapping a thick branch. Not just a twig under someone's foot, but like someone deliberately breaking a branch the thickness of my wrist. Snap. Then another. Snap. Chris was awake too. "You hear that?" he whispered. "Yeah," I replied, grabbing my flashlight. "Probably just an animal." We unzipped the tent and poked our heads out. Mike was already outside his tent, scanning the tree line with his headlamp. "What the hell is that?" he whispered. Before anyone could answer, something hit the ground near our fire pit with a dull thud. A rock. Not huge, maybe the size of a tennis ball, but definitely a rock. Then another one landed about 10 feet away. "Is someone messing with us?" Sarah called from her tent. I swept my flashlight across the tree line, but saw nothing. The woods were thick and dark beyond the first few yards of trees. That's when another rock hit Mike and Jen's tent. Ping! Right on the metal tent pole, loud enough to make us all jump. "Hey!" Mike shouted toward the trees. "We know you're out there!" Silence. Just the chirping of insects and the distant sound of the river. We all grabbed flashlights and slowly circled the campsite, staying close together. The uneasiness in my gut was growing with each step. This didn't feel like drunk campers or teenagers pulling a prank. Something felt off. We'd made it halfway around the perimeter when we heard it, a deep, guttural howl that echoed through the clearing. It wasn't a wolf or coyote. It was deeper, more powerful, almost like it came from something with a massive chest cavity. The sound vibrated through me, raising every hair on my body. And then, from the direction of the river, maybe a quarter-mile away, came an answer. The same type of howl, but more distant. "What the actual fuck was that?" Chris whispered, his voice shaking. "Let's get back to the tents," I said, but Mike shook his head. "I think we should get to the cars." We'd parked about 30 yards from our tents, at the edge of the clearing where a crude dirt road cut through the trees. No one argued with Mike's suggestion. We quickly grabbed our phones, wallets, and keys, not bothering with anything else. As we rushed toward the vehicles, Mike's pickup truck and my SUV, more rocks landed around us. One hit the ground so close to Sarah's foot that she screamed. We couldn't see who or what was throwing them. Once we reached the cars, we piled in, Mike, Jen, and Sarah in the truck, Chris and I in my SUV. We locked the doors and sat there, breathing hard, trying to process what was happening. "Should we just leave?" Jen asked, her voice carrying through the open windows of the vehicles. "And leave all our gear," I replied. "That's like $1,500 worth of stuff." "I don't give a shit about the gear," Sarah said. "We want to go." Mike suggested we wait it out, see if whoever was messing with us would get bored and leave. So we sat there with the engines off, peering into the darkness. The rocks had stopped once we got to the cars. For about an hour, nothing happened. We started to relax a bit, even laughed nervously about how scared we'd been. Maybe it was just some local jerk who'd moved on. Then, at around 2:30, according to my phone, Mike's truck suddenly rocked side to side, as if something heavy had bumped into it. I heard Jen yelp from inside the cab. "Turn on the lights!" Chris yelled. I hit the headlights of my SUV at the same moment Mike turned on his high beams. The combined light flooded the edge of the clearing, and that's when I saw it. Standing just beyond where the grass met the trees was something I still struggle to describe. It was massive, easily 8 feet tall, and covered in dark, matted hair. Its shoulders were impossibly broad, like a linebacker on steroids, and its arms hung down past its waist. Even from 30 yards away, I could see its chest heaving with each breath it took. But it was the face that froze my blood. The sloped forehead, the pronounced jaw, the deep-set eyes reflecting our headlights. It wasn't human, but it wasn't quite animal either. "Holy shit," Chris whispered beside me. "That's a fucking Sasquatch." The creature stood perfectly still, staring at our vehicles. 5 seconds, 10 seconds. Then, with a deliberate movement that seemed almost casual, it stepped sideways behind a large palmetto. Immediately after it disappeared, another rock sailed out of the darkness and landed with a thud near our extinguished fire pit. "There's more than one," I said, my voice barely audible even to myself. No one slept that night. We stayed in the vehicles, engines occasionally running to keep the batteries from dying when we needed the lights. Throughout those endless hours, we heard them moving around the campsite, heavy footsteps circling our tents, deep huffing grunts from multiple directions. Occasionally, something would slap against the side of one of our vehicles, not hard enough to damage anything, but enough to make us jump every single time. Around 4 in the morning, the activity seemed to intensify. The footsteps became more frequent, and twice more we heard those bone-chilling howls echoing back and forth. Once, I caught a glimpse of movement at the edge of our headlights, just a massive, dark shape moving between trees. I've never been so grateful to see the sun rise. As the first light broke through the trees around 5:30, the sounds finally stopped. We waited another hour, just to be sure, before cautiously getting out of the vehicles. Our campsite looked like it had been visited by vandals. Rocks of various sizes were scattered everywhere. One of the tents, Sarah's, had been knocked over, its poles bent at odd angles. Our cooler had been dragged about 20 feet from where we'd left it, its contents strewn across the ground, but what made my stomach drop were the footprints. In the soft dirt near the fire pit and leading toward the trees were unmistakable impressions. Enormous footprints, easily 18 inches long, showing 5 widely spaced toes. They were deeply pressed into the ground, suggesting whatever made them was incredibly heavy. Mike, who'd spent years hunting in the Florida wilderness, knelt down to examine them. "The stride length between these prints is insane," he said quietly. "Whatever made these was taking steps almost twice as long as a tall human." We followed the tracks to the edge of the clearing, where they disappeared into the harder ground of the woods. None of us suggested following them further. We packed up in record time, barely speaking, each of us processing what had happened. Our gear was mostly intact, though one of the tents was ruined and some food items were missing from the cooler. As we loaded everything into the vehicles, I couldn't shake the feeling we were being watched from the trees. Just before we left, Chris pointed to something on the ground near where we'd first seen the creature. It was a clump of dark, coarse hair caught on a low palmetto frond. None of us touched it. None of us wanted any souvenirs from that night. The drive home was mostly silent. What could we say? We'd encountered something that wasn't supposed to exist. A Florida skunk ape, or several of them, had systematically harassed us until we retreated, defending what they clearly considered their territory. When we finally started talking about it later that day, we realized the pattern in what had happened. The branch breaking, a warning. The rocks, an escalation when we didn't leave. The howls, communication between them. The rocking of the vehicles, a display of strength. They hadn't attacked us directly. They'd used intimidation tactics to drive us away. I've spent countless hours since then researching similar encounters in the Mayaka River area. There are dozens of reports going back decades, stories eerily similar to ours. Most people call the creature the skunk ape, or the Mayaka skunk ape, Florida's version of Bigfoot. We never reported our experience to any authorities. What would we say? That we were chased off by a family of Sasquatch? We'd be laughed out of the station. But we did make a pact. None of us will ever camp in that area again. In fact, I haven't been camping anywhere since. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night thinking I hear that deep, powerful howl echoing through my neighborhood. I know it's just my mind playing tricks, but the fear is real. The memory of that massive silhouette standing at the edge of the clearing, watching us with those intelligent eyes, is burned into my brain. I don't expect anyone to believe this story. Most days, I can barely believe it myself, but I know what I saw. I know what we all experienced. And I know that somewhere in the wilderness along the Mayaka River, something walks on 2 feet that science says doesn't exist. Story 2. I've been debating whether to write this down for so long. It's been nearly 5 months since it happened, and I still wake up in cold sweats. I keep telling myself that putting it on paper might help, but every time I try, my hands start shaking. Guess today's the day I finally get it out. This happened back in October of last year, 1891. My friend William Vivian, everyone calls him WW, and I were traveling through Gladwin County on business. I work as a lumber assessor, and WW is my assistant of sorts. We'd been sent to evaluate some woodland parcels that a company in Bay City was looking to purchase. It was unusually warm for mid-October. The leaves had turned that beautiful mixture of red and gold, but the air still had that summer feel to it. We'd been on the road for 3 days, staying at small inns along the way. W had brought his bulldog Rex along for the journey. That dog went everywhere with him, loyal to a fault and built like a barrel with legs. We'd finished our assessment earlier that day and were taking a shortcut through a densely wooded area that the locals called Miller's Tract. It was supposed to save us about 4 hours on our journey back to town. The path was barely visible, just a thin strip of dirt cutting through the underbrush. The trees were massive old-growth pines and oaks, blocking out most of the sunlight. About 2 hours into our trek, WW needed to relieve himself, so we stopped by a small clearing. I remember checking my pocket watch. It was just past 3 in the afternoon. While waiting, I noticed how quiet it had gotten. Usually the woods are full of noise, birds, squirrels, the wind in the trees, but at that moment there was nothing. Complete silence. Even Rex, who was normally sniffing around investigating everything, was standing still, his ears perked up. I called out to WW. "You notice how quiet it's gotten?" He was just buttoning up his trousers when he nodded. "Something ain't right," he said. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I felt a chill run down my spine despite the warmth of the day. Rex started growling low in his throat, facing northeast toward a thick stand of trees. That's when we smelled it, like rotting meat mixed with wet animal fur, so strong it made my eyes water. W covered his nose with his handkerchief and grabbed Rex's collar to keep him from bolting. "Let's get moving," I said, reaching for our packs. But before we could take a step, there was a cracking sound like a tree branch breaking, followed by heavy footfalls. I'll never forget what emerged from those trees. At first I thought it was a bear standing on its hind legs, but as it moved into the clearing, I realized with horror that it was shaped like a man, a massive, hair-covered man. It stood at least 7 feet tall, probably closer to 8. Its body was completely naked, but covered in dark, matted hair. Not fur like an animal, but hair, like a man's, only all over its body. Its face, God help me. Its face was almost human, but not quite. The jaw was too prominent, the nose flat and wide, and its eyes were deep-set and dark, but unmistakably intelligent. Those eyes are what haunt me the most in my nightmares. They weren't the eyes of an animal. They were looking at us with awareness, with calculation. And I stood frozen. I couldn't even breathe. The creature just stood there for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only seconds, watching us. Its massive hands hung at its sides, reaching below its knees, unnaturally long arms that ended in huge hands with thick fingers. Rex was the first to break the standoff. He tore free from WW's grip and charged the creature, barking furiously. Björn shouted for him to come back, but it was too late. The dog lunged at the creature's leg, but before Rex could sink his teeth in, the thing moved with shocking speed. It swung one of those massive hands in a sideways motion, catching Rex in mid-air. There was a sickening crack, and Rex went flying, hitting the trunk of a nearby tree with such force that I heard his body break. He fell to the ground and didn't move again. W let out a strangled cry. I grabbed his arm to keep him from rushing toward his dog. The creature turned its attention back to us, and for one terrible moment, I was certain it was going to charge. I could feel my heart hammering against my ribs so hard I thought it might burst. Instead, it made a sound, not quite a roar, not quite a howl. It was deep and guttural, vibrating through the clearing. Then it turned and fled in the opposite direction, but it didn't run like a man or even like any animal I've ever seen. It took enormous leaping bounds, covering 20 feet or more with each jump. I know that sounds impossible, but I swear on my mother's grave, that's what I saw. It moved like nothing natural, leaping over fallen logs and disappearing into the trees faster than any human could possibly move. W broke free from my grip and ran to Rex. I followed, but I already knew the dog was dead. Its body was twisted at an unnatural angle, blood trickling from its mouth. W knelt beside him, trembling. "We need to go," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Now." WW wouldn't leave Rex behind. He wrapped the dog in his coat and carried him as we hurried back the way we'd come. We didn't speak much. What was there to say? We'd seen something that shouldn't exist, something that killed a strong bulldog with a single blow. We made it back to the main road just before dusk and flagged down a passing wagon. The driver took one look at our pale faces and the dead dog and offered us a ride to the nearest town without asking questions. When we reached Gladwin that evening, we went straight to the sheriff's office. Sheriff Dawson was a big man with a graying mustache who'd been in charge of the county for 15 years. He listened patiently as we recounted our story, his expression growing increasingly skeptical. "So you're telling me you saw some kind of giant, hairy wild man that killed your dog with one swipe and then bounded away like a jackrabbit?" he said when we finished. UW, still cradling Rex's body, nodded emphatically. "It wasn't human, Sheriff. I've hunted every animal in these woods since I was a boy, and I've never seen anything like it." Sheriff Dawson sighed and scratched his chin. "Look, gentlemen, I don't think you're lying. I think you saw something that scared you, and in your panic maybe you embellished the details in your minds. We know what we saw," I insisted. "It was no bear, no wolf. It walked on two legs like a man, but was covered in hair." The sheriff agreed to send a deputy out to the area the next day to look around, but I could tell he was just humoring us. We spent the night at the local inn, barely sleeping. UW buried Rex behind the inn at dawn, neither of us speaking much. The deputy returned by midday, reporting he'd found nothing unusual. No tracks, no sign of any creature. Just some disturbed undergrowth that could have been caused by anything. Over the next few days, we heard rumors that other people had spotted strange things in those woods over the years. An old trapper told us about finding massive footprints, nearly 16 inches long. A woman who lived on the edge of the forest claimed something had watched her through her window one night, something tall that disappeared when her husband came to look. But no one had seen anything like what we described. No giant, hair-covered man-thing that could kill a dog with one blow and leap through the forest like it was flying. We left Gladwin a week later, our business concluded, but our minds forever changed. W. never got another dog. He said he couldn't bear to put another animal at risk. As for me, I've turned down every job that would take me back to Gladwin County. Some places, once you've seen what lurks in their shadows, you just can't bring yourself to return to. I've read about similar sightings in newspapers since then, reports from Oregon, Washington, even Canada. People describing giant, hairy men in the wilderness. Most folks laugh these stories off as tall tales or the ravings of drunkards. Before that day in October, I would have been among the skeptics. Sometimes I try to convince myself that's all it was. Just a bear that my frightened mind transformed into something more monstrous. But then I remember those eyes looking back at me, the intelligence in them, the way it moved, the impossible strength and speed, and I know that whatever we encountered in those woods, it wasn't any animal catalogued in science books. I still have nightmares about those few minutes in the clearing. In them, the creature doesn't run away. Instead, it charges us, those massive hands reaching out. I always wake up just before it grabs me, my sheets soaked with sweat. W. And I don't talk about it much anymore. What's the point? No one believes us anyway. But sometimes, when we've had a few drinks, he'll look at me and say, "You remember, don't you, George? You remember what we saw?" And I'll nod, because how could I ever forget? I don't know what that thing was. Some kind of wild man, a missing link between man and beast, something else entirely. I only know that it exists, and it's out there in the woods of Michigan, watching and waiting. And I know that when I'm in the forest now, even back home in Bay City, I find myself constantly looking over my shoulder, listening for the snap of branches, catching whiffs of strange scents on the breeze. Because once you've seen something like that, you can never unsee it. You can never feel completely safe in the wilderness again. If you're ever traveling through Gladwin County, especially through Miller's Tract, keep your eyes open and your dogs close. And if the forest suddenly goes quiet, if the birds stop singing and the squirrels stop chattering, don't wait around to find out why. Run. Run as fast as you can, because there are things in this world that defy explanation, things that shouldn't exist, but do, and sometimes they're watching you. Story 3. I still can't believe what happened to me last summer. I've been trying to make sense of it for months now, but I can't explain it away no matter how hard I try. I've never been the type to believe in monsters or cryptids, but after what I saw that day at the river, I'm questioning everything I thought I knew. It was early August, one of those sweltering days where the heat just radiates off everything. I'd taken my mountain bike out to this secluded spot along the river about 15 miles outside of town. It's this little unmarked trail that branches off from the main hiking path. Not many people know about it. I'd been going there for years, whenever I needed some peace and quiet. I arrived around noon, leaned my bike against a tree, and made my way down to this fallen log that sits right at the water's edge. It's the perfect spot, shaded by some overhanging trees, but with a clear view across the river. The water was low that time of year, barely knee-deep in most spots, moving slowly over the rocks. I'd been sitting there for maybe 20 minutes, just cooling my feet in the water and watching dragonflies zip back and forth across the surface. The only sounds were the gentle current, some birds chirping, and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. It was peaceful, exactly what I needed after a stressful week at work. That's when I noticed movement on the opposite bank, maybe 70 yards upstream. At first, I thought it was just a deer coming down for a drink. They're all over this area. But as I focused on it, I realized it was way too big for a deer. My next thought was that it was another hiker, maybe someone fishing. But something about the way it moved just didn't seem human. This thing emerged from between two big pine trees and walked straight into the shallow water. It was massive, I'm talking at least 7 or 8 feet tall, and it wasn't walking upright like a person exactly, but it wasn't on all fours either. It had this hunched posture with incredibly long arms that hung down almost to its knees. I froze completely. My heart started racing so fast I could feel it pounding in my throat. I was partly hidden by some tall cattails growing along the bank, so I stayed absolutely still, afraid that any movement would draw attention to me. The creature waded into the middle of the river, where the water was maybe 2 feet deep. Then it started doing something really strange. It began leaning over and digging around in the riverbed, almost like it was searching for something under the rocks. I remember thinking it looked like it was hunting for crayfish or maybe freshwater mussels. That's when I got my first good look at it. Its entire body was covered in thick, dark brown hair, not patchy like a mangy bear, but completely covered except for parts of its face. The hair looked matted in some places, especially around what I guessed were its shoulders. Speaking of which, those shoulders were enormous, easily twice as wide as mine, and I'm not a small guy. Its legs looked powerful, like tree trunks, and its arms... God, those arms were unnervingly long and ended in what looked like massive hands. But it was the head that really got to me. It wasn't shaped like a human head at all. It was wider, flatter somehow, with this pronounced brow ridge that shadowed its eyes. The face was this bizarre mix between what I'd imagine a primitive human and an ape would look like. And the size of this thing... I'm 6'2", and this creature would have towered over me. I was completely frozen, barely breathing, watching this thing splash around in the water. It would occasionally pick something up and bring it to its mouth. I couldn't make out exactly what it was eating, but it was definitely finding food of some kind. I must have been watching it for about 5 minutes when my allergies betrayed me. I felt a tickle in my throat. Tried desperately to suppress it, but ended up letting out this pathetic little cough. It wasn't loud, but in that quiet setting, it might as well have been a gunshot. The creature instantly tensed up. It straightened slightly and turned its head from side to side, not looking directly at anything, but clearly listening. The way it moved reminded me of how a deer gets alert when it senses danger. All senses heightened, completely focused on detecting threats. I ducked down lower behind the cattails, my heart pounding so hard I was sure it could hear that too. For what felt like forever, it just stood there in the middle of the river, completely still, except for its head slowly turning. Then it suddenly moved toward the opposite bank, disappearing behind some tall grass. I let out the breath I'd been holding, thinking maybe it had moved on. I was debating whether to grab my bike and get the hell out of there when I heard a splash from somewhere upstream, hidden by the bend in the river. That's when the first rock hit. It landed about 6 feet to my right with a heavy thud, splashing into the shallow water near the bank. It wasn't small, probably the size of a softball. Before I could even process what was happening, 2 more rocks landed near the log where I was sitting, one of them splintering the bark. Holy shit, it was throwing rocks at me. I scrambled to my feet, grabbed my backpack, and started backing away toward my bike, never taking my eyes off the river. That's when I saw it. The creature had crossed the river already and was standing just 30 yards away, partially hidden behind a cluster of young trees. It was even more massive up close. The hair covering its body wasn't just brown like I'd thought from a distance. It was a mix of black and dark brown, with some reddish tints in places. Its chest was enormous, barrel-shaped, and its shoulders looked like they belonged on a linebacker. I could see its face clearly now. The skin was a leathery brownish-gray color, rough-looking and wrinkled around the eyes. Its nose was wide and flat, and its eyes, those eyes were slightly bulging, set deep under that prominent brow ridge. They were dark. I couldn't make out a color, but they were fixed directly on me. There was intelligence there, and something else I couldn't identify. What happened next will haunt me forever. It reached down, picked up another rock, and deliberately threw it at me. Not around me this time, at me. The rock whizzed past my head, missing by inches. I grabbed my bike and started running down the trail, not even trying to mount it yet because the ground was too uneven. I could hear heavy footsteps behind me, crashing through the underbrush. Whatever this thing was, it was following me. Then I heard it, a sound that made my blood turn to ice, a long, drawn-out howl that seemed to echo through the trees. It wasn't like a wolf or coyote. It was deeper, more resonant, almost like it started as a growl and transformed into this wailing sound that rose and fell in pitch. What was worse? There was an answer. From somewhere across the river, another similar howl responded, then another. There were more of them. As I ran along the trail with my bike, pushing it beside me and occasionally glancing back, I caught glimpses through the trees of movement on the opposite riverbank. At least 2 large shapes were moving through the brush, keeping pace with me as I ran. They were paralleling my escape route. I've never been so terrified in my life. My legs were burning, my lungs felt like they were going to explode, but pure adrenaline kept me going. The trail follows the river for about a mile before it opens up to a small parking area with a boat ramp. That's where my car was. I finally reached a stretch of trail smooth enough to jump on my bike. I hopped on and pedaled harder than I ever have before, the sound of my tires on the dirt path and my own panicked breathing drowning out whatever might have been behind me. But I could still feel it. That sensation of being hunted, of being followed by something that could catch me if it really wanted to. When I finally burst out of the tree line into the parking lot, I nearly crashed my bike. I scrambled to my feet, threw my bike in the back of my car and peeled out of there, gravel flying everywhere. I didn't slow down until I hit the main highway, and even then, I kept checking my rearview mirror. It's been months, and I still haven't told many people who would believe me. I know what I saw wasn't a bear, wasn't a man in a suit, wasn't any animal that's supposed to exist in these woods. The intelligence in those eyes, the way it threw those rocks with clear intent, the coordinated way they seemed to track me along both sides of the river. I've spent hours researching since then, falling down internet rabbit holes reading about similar encounters. I know now what I saw. It was a Bigfoot, and the most terrifying part, it wasn't alone. There was a whole group of them out there, communicating, cooperating, hunting. I haven't been back to that spot since. Sometimes I think about going back with a camera, trying to get proof, but then I remember those eyes looking directly into mine, and that deliberate rock throw that nearly took my head off. And I know better. Whatever they are, they don't want to be found. And after what I experienced, I'm not sure I want to find them again either. Story 4. I honestly don't know why I'm finally sharing this after keeping it quiet for so long. Maybe I just need to get it off my chest. Maybe I'm hoping someone out there has dealt with something similar and can offer advice. Either way, here goes. For 15 years, 15 damn years, I've been dealing with what I can only describe as a Bigfoot visiting my property every fall. I know how that sounds. Trust me, I do. I was the biggest skeptic you could imagine before all this started. I used to laugh at those TV shows where they go hunting for Bigfoot with night vision goggles. Not anymore. I live on a small farm in southern Ohio. Nothing fancy. About 12 acres, mostly wooded, with a modest house, a barn, and a chicken coop. I've always kept chickens. Started with just 8 hens for eggs, but eventually expanded to around 30 birds. They were my pride and joy. Were. That's the key word. It all began in October, 15 years ago. I remember it was a Wednesday because I'd been watching that crime show I liked that aired on Wednesdays back then. I went to bed around 11, and sometime in the middle of the night, must have been around 2 in the morning, I woke up to this horrible commotion outside. It sounded like metal tearing and chickens going absolutely nuts. I grabbed my flashlight and shotgun, standard procedure for checking disturbances out here. Threw on my boots and ran outside in my pajamas. What I found still gives me chills. The chicken coop door, which was solid metal, mind you, had been completely torn off its hinges and thrown about 10 feet away, not just open, completely removed and tossed aside like it was nothing. Half my chickens were gone, and the rest were in a complete panic. But what really got me were the tracks. They were footprints, but massive, easily 15 inches long, too big to be human, too clearly defined to be a bear. They looked like giant bare human feet, but the stride length between them was insane, like 4 feet apart. Whatever made them was huge and walked on 2 legs. I called the sheriff's department and they sent a deputy out. He looked at everything, took some photos of the prints, and basically told me it was probably just some kids playing a prank. Right, because teenagers regularly tear metal doors off hinges with their bare hands and leave giant footprints behind. After that first incident, I convinced myself it must have been a bear, despite the evidence not really matching up. I reinforced the coop with stronger hinges, added a metal bar across the door, and went on with my life. Until exactly 11 months later, in September, when it happened again. This time the door wasn't torn off. The entire wall of the coop had been pushed in, not smashed, but pushed, like something with incredible strength had just leaned against it until it gave way. More chickens gone, more of those same giant footprints. That's when I started taking this seriously. I installed motion sensor lights all around the coop. I set up 4 trail cameras pointing in different directions. I even slept in my barn for a week with my shotgun, hoping to catch whatever was doing this. The creature, or whatever it is, proved smarter than I expected. The motion lights would go off, but the cameras would show nothing, or they'd be found turned in different directions the next morning. Once I found a camera completely dismantled, its parts laid out nearly on the ground, like someone had carefully taken it apart. Over the years, I've gotten a few glimpses of it. The first real look I got was about 5 years in. I heard the motion lights trigger and ran outside with my most powerful flashlight. I caught it just as it was heading back into the woods, over 8 feet tall, covered in dark, almost black hair. It moved so quickly and quietly for something that size. When my light beam hit it, it turned briefly, and I saw eyes reflect back. Not red like a deer's, but a yellowish glow. I fired a warning shot into the air, and it disappeared into the trees faster than anything that large should be able to move. I've learned its patterns over time. It doesn't come every night. Sometimes there are weeks between visits. It only seems interested in my chickens, never in me or my house. Sometimes it takes chickens alive. Other times it kills them on sight and leaves the carcasses behind, almost like it got interrupted. I tried leaving food out, deer meat, fruit, even a whole turkey once, thinking maybe I could satisfy it without losing my chickens. It took the offerings, but still raided the coop anyway. One year, I got smart and set up a second hidden chicken coop in a different part of my property, thinking I could outsmart it. Within a week, it found the new coop too. That's when I realized it was watching me, observing my patterns and activities. This wasn't just some animal acting on instinct. There are other signs of its presence I've noticed over the years. Sometimes I find sticks arranged in patterns against trees, almost like trail markers. I hear tree knocks, 3 sharp hits in succession, in the woods behind my property. Occasionally there's what sounds like intentional chattering, low guttural sounds that don't match any animal I know of. About 5 years ago, I decided to be bold. I sat silently on my porch one night, no lights, no movement, just watching and waiting. Around midnight I saw it, a huge shadow at the edge of the forest, just standing there. It wasn't moving toward the coop, it was watching my house, watching me. We stayed like that, this bizarre standoff, for nearly 20 minutes before it simply turned and walked back into the woods. I didn't sleep for 2 days after that. Last fall was the most recent incident. I've reinforced the co-op so much over the years that it's practically a fortress now. Steel mesh, concrete foundation, industrial hinges, multiple locks. The break-ins have decreased. but I still find evidence of attempts. Large handprints in the dirt, bent metal, where something tried to pry the door open. 3 weeks ago, right around dusk, I was in my workshop fixing a broken fence post when I heard something outside. It wasn't the usual sounds. This was deliberate. 3 loud knocks on the side of my workshop, like someone hitting it with their fist. Then, silence. I grabbed my work hammer and slowly opened the door. Nothing was there, but the air felt different, heavy, like when a storm is about to break, and there was this smell, musky, like wet fur and dirt. I walked around the workshop looking for prints or signs, and that's when I heard it. A deep, rumbling grunt from the tree line about 50 yards away. I raised my flashlight and caught just a glimpse of movement, something large moving between the trees. I called out, "I see you there!" The woods went completely silent. No birds, no insects, nothing. Just dead silence. Then it responded, not with words, but with 3 more knocks from deeper in the woods. Then something else. A series of clicks and what sounded almost like speech, but no language I've ever heard. Low, guttural sounds that seemed deliberately patterned. It wasn't random animal noise. It had rhythm and purpose. I did something stupid then. I knocked back 3 times on a nearby tree. The silence that followed was deafening. For about 30 seconds, nothing happened. Then, from much closer, maybe only 20 yards into the woods, came an answering series of knocks. 1, then 2, then 3. A pattern, a response. I raised my flashlight again, sweeping it across the tree line, and caught 2 reflective eyes staring back at me. They were at least 7 feet off the ground. We held that gaze for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only seconds. Then it blinked, actually blinked, and was gone. That night, I didn't lose any chickens, but I found something on my porch the next morning, a small pile of berries and 2 freshly killed rabbits. An offering, a trade, I still don't know. What gets me the most is the intelligence behind all this. This isn't just some animal following instinct. It plans, it adapts, it observes. When I reinforce the coop one way, it finds another way in. When I set up cameras, it avoids them or disables them. It's been coming to my property for 15 years, always in the fall, always with purpose. I've thought about selling the place and moving, but this is my home, and honestly, part of me is afraid it would follow me. That sounds crazy, I know. But after 15 years of this bizarre relationship, I can't shake the feeling that this thing knows me as much as I know it. Last night, I heard the tree knocks again. 3 distinct hits, then silence. Fall is coming, and I know it'll be back. I've reinforced the coop again, added new locks, even installed a metal roof, but something tells me that won't matter. This has become a game of sorts. A yearly challenge between me and this creature. The strangest part? I'm not even sure I want it to end anymore. As terrifying as these encounters are, there's something almost respectful about how this creature and I interact. It could easily break into my house if it wanted to. It's powerful enough to tear metal doors off hinges, but it doesn't. It stays in its domain, and I stay in mine, with this bizarre annual ritual between us. I don't know what to do anymore. I don't know who to tell, who would believe me. I have some photos of the footprints, but they're not clear enough to convince a skeptic. The few trail camera images I've managed to get just show blurry shadows that could be anything. So I keep my shotgun loaded during fall. I keep my lights bright, and I wait for those 3 knocks that tell me my visitor has returned for another year. Story 5. I've never been the type to believe in myths or monsters. Frank and I have always been practical people. Him with his accounting background and me with my nursing career. We raised 2 boys, paid our taxes, went to church on Sundays, and lived what most would call a normal life. But what happened to us in 2006 changed everything I thought I knew about this world. When our boys gifted us matching metal detectors for our retirement, I thought it was sweet, but a bit silly. Frank took to it immediately, though. He'd been cooped up in an office for 40 years and suddenly had all this energy with nowhere to put it. Metal detecting got us outside, walking, and gave us something to talk about besides our aching joints or what was happening on our favorite TV shows. We started small, local parks, schoolyards, places where people drop things, found lots of bottle caps, some coins, the occasional piece of jewelry. Nothing spectacular, but it was fun. Eventually, we upgraded our equipment and started seeking out historical sites. That's how we ended up in Siskiyou County, California, in our RV that summer. The area was gorgeous. Tall trees, clean air, and so many historical trails from the gold rush era. We'd heard that an old stagecoach route ran through parts of the Sixes River Forest, and Frank was convinced we might find something valuable that travelers had dropped a century ago. That morning started like any other. We had breakfast in the RV, scrambled eggs and toast for Frank, oatmeal for me because of my cholesterol. The weather was perfect, not too hot, with a slight breeze. We packed water bottles, trail mix, our detectors, and small digging tools. Frank even brought his bird identification book, as he'd spotted some species he wasn't familiar with the day before. We'd been on the trail for maybe 3 hours. I remember checking my watch around 11:30 and thinking we should turn back soon for lunch. The trail wasn't marked well, but it followed a logical path along what must have been the easiest route for stagecoaches. Frank was being sweet that day, carrying both our detectors because my arthritis was acting up. I walked ahead about 30 feet or so while he methodically swept the ground behind me. The forest was quiet that day. Looking back, that should have been my first clue that something was off. Usually, there were birds singing, squirrels rustling in the underbrush, all those forest sounds. But I didn't notice the silence then. I was too busy thinking about whether I'd remembered to turn off the propane in the RV. I rounded a slight bend in the trail, and that's when I saw it. At first, my brain couldn't process what I was looking at. About 40 feet ahead, just off the trail near a cluster of young redwoods, stood something that made my heart stop. "Frank," I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. Then louder, "Frank, come here." I didn't turn around. I couldn't take my eyes off it. It was shaped like a man, but it wasn't a man. Taller than Frank, who's 6 feet even, but not by much. Maybe 6'3" or 4. But it was the build that was so striking. Shoulders twice as broad as a normal person's, with massive arms hanging down almost to its knees. The body was covered in dark hair. Not fur exactly, but longer hair, especially around the shoulders and back. Its face, though, that's what I can't forget. It looked almost human, with a smaller head than you'd expect for such a large body. The face had long black hair, tucked behind ears that stuck out prominently from the sides of its head, and it had a beard, not a full beard like Frank's, but curlier, concentrated mostly on the chin and jawline. The eyes were deep set, watching us with what I can only describe as intelligence. When Frank caught up to me, I felt his hand on my shoulder. He inhaled sharply when he saw it. The creature was just standing there, swaying slightly from side to side, like it was nervous or trying to decide what to do. "Is that?" Frank whispered, unable to finish his sentence. I nodded, unable to speak. My mouth had gone completely dry. The creature made a sound then, a soft hoo-hoo noise from deep in its throat. It wasn't threatening, more like it was acknowledging us. I realized I'd been holding my breath and let it out slowly. "Hello?" I said, instantly feeling ridiculous for trying to talk to it. It responded with that same hoo-hoo sound, a bit louder this time. Frank took a step forward, still holding the metal detectors, and the creature's eyes immediately focused on them. Its entire demeanor changed. The swaying became more pronounced, and it shifted its weight from foot to foot. It seemed frightened of the detectors. "I think it believes they're weapons," Frank whispered to me. I nodded, unable to tear my eyes away from this impossible being standing in front of us. We'd both heard stories about Bigfoot, of course. Who hasn't? But like UFOs or the Loch Ness Monster, we'd always considered them to be campfire stories. Not something we'd ever encounter in real life. When Frank took another step toward me, the creature responded immediately. It took one enormous step backward, a single fluid motion that covered more ground than 3 or 4 of our steps would have. Then it turned, and I'll never forget this as long as I live. It moved through the forest with such grace that it barely disturbed the underbrush. For something so large, it moved like a shadow, silent and fast. Within seconds, it had disappeared among the trees. Frank and I stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only a minute or two. My legs were shaking so badly I had to sit down right there on the trail. Frank sat beside me, both metal detectors laid across his lap. "Did we just see?" He started. "I think we did," I finished for him. "We didn't say much on the walk back to our RV. What was there to say? We'd just seen something that wasn't supposed to exist." I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see it following us. But the forest remained empty and silent. Back at the RV, Frank poured us both a finger of whiskey. Something we almost never do during the day. We sat at our little dinette table, hands wrapped around our glasses, and tried to make sense of what we'd seen. "Could it have been a man in a costume?" I asked, knowing how ridiculous that sounded even as I said it. "Who would be out there in the middle of nowhere, dressed up like that?" Frank shook his head. "No costume I've ever seen moves like that." "And did you see its eyes? Those weren't plastic or glass. Those were real eyes, Mary, intelligent eyes." That night, neither of us slept well. Every sound outside the RV made me jump. The next morning, we debated whether to tell anyone. Who would believe us? 2 retirees claiming they saw Bigfoot while metal detecting. We'd sound like we were losing our minds. But later that day, while getting supplies at a small general store near the forest, I overheard a local talking about strange sounds in the woods. I couldn't help myself. I asked if there had been any unusual sightings in the area. The cashier, an older woman with grey hair pulled back in a braid, looked at me knowingly. "You saw something out there, didn't you?" I hesitated, then nodded. She leaned forward. "Folks around here have been seeing things in those woods for generations. Most don't talk about it with outsiders because they don't want to be laughed at, but ask anyone who's lived here their whole life. They all have a story or know someone who does." She told us that the Sixes River forest area had a long history of Bigfoot stories. Some of the local indigenous tribes had legends going back centuries about forest beings that matched what we described. More recently, there had been dozens of reported sightings by hikers, campers, and locals. We stayed in Siskiyou County for another week, but we didn't go back to that trail. Frank wanted to, said we should try to get a picture if we saw it again, but I couldn't bring myself to return. The memory of those eyes looking at us was too unsettling. We've since moved to Florida. The weather's better for my arthritis, and we still metal detect, though now it's mostly on beaches looking for lost jewelry and coins. Sometimes when we're walking along the shore at sunset, Frank will say, "Remember California?" And I'll know exactly what he's talking about. I've tried researching what we saw. There are online forums full of people sharing similar experiences, some more believable than others. I've read scientific arguments both for and against the existence of such creatures, but in the end, it doesn't matter what anyone else believes. Frank and I know what we saw that day. That creature, that being, was real. It was intelligent, it was cautious, and it was just as surprised to see us as we were to see it. I still shake when I think about it, not from fear exactly, but from the knowledge that the world is stranger and more mysterious than we allow ourselves to believe. There are things in the forests and mountains that haven't been explained, categorized, or understood by science. Things that watch us from the shadows of trees, as curious about us as we are about them. I've never told this story publicly before. Our sons would think we've gone senile if we tried to explain it to them, but I know what I saw, and sometimes at night I still hear that soft hoo-hoo sound in my dreams. Story 6. I've been sitting on this experience for almost a decade now, and I still get goosebumps every time I think about it. I don't care if anyone believes me or not. I just need to get it off my chest because it still haunts me. My Uncle Roy owns a beautiful 68-acre parcel of land in Harford County, Maryland. Well, he used to own it. He sold it a few years back after what happened. For years, it was our sanctuary. We'd hunt, fish, shoot targets, and just enjoy being outdoors. The property had everything: dense woods, a small stream, open fields, and an old barn that we'd use as a makeshift headquarters when we'd spend weekends there. This all happened in September of 2014. It was one of those perfect early fall days, not too hot, not too cold, with that crisp smell in the air that hunters love. Me, my Uncle Roy, and two of our hunting buddies, Dave and Mike, decided to head out to the property to sight in our rifles for the upcoming deer season. We'd set up a proper little range on the eastern side of the property where there was a natural backstop from a small hill. We'd been shooting for maybe an hour, just having a good time, talking about our plans for the hunting season. I remember I'd just finished firing a group with my .308 and was pretty pleased with how tight the shots were clustered. That's when Dave suddenly went quiet mid-sentence. The way his face changed, I'll never forget it. His eyes got wide and he was staring past us toward the tree line about 100 yards away. "What the hell is that?" he whispered. We all turned to look. At first I didn't see anything, but then I noticed movement at the edge of the woods. Something was there, partially obscured by the undergrowth, something big and dark, and standing on two legs. My first thought was bear, but this thing was too tall, too upright. Black bears in Maryland don't stand on their hind legs for that long, and they definitely don't move the way this thing was moving. It was purposeful, deliberate. "Don't move," Roy whispered. We all had rifles, but nobody raised them. We were frozen, watching this thing as it emerged slightly from the tree line. I still remember the way my stomach dropped when I got a clearer look. It was massive, easily 7 or 8 feet tall, covered in dark, almost black hair. But what struck me most was the way it moved, fluid and powerful like an athlete, not lumbering like a bear at all. Then it did something I'll never forget. It reached up, grabbed hold of a young tree, maybe 50 feet tall, and just shook it violently, like it was nothing more than a sapling. The entire tree thrashed back and forth, branches whipping through the air, leaves scattering everywhere. The display of raw strength was terrifying. No human could do that. No bear would do that. We all stood there, speechless, as this thing continued shaking the tree for what felt like forever, but was probably only 15 or 20 seconds. Then, as suddenly as it appeared, it dropped back into the forest and was gone. Nobody said anything for a solid minute. The only sound was our breathing, which had all gotten heavier without us realizing it. "What the fuck was that?" Mike finally broke the silence, his voice higher than usual. "I don't know," Roy said slowly, "but I think we're done shooting for today." We packed up in record time, constantly looking over our shoulders. The drive back to Roy's house was almost completely silent. When we finally got there, we tried to rationalize what we'd seen. Maybe it was someone playing a prank in a costume, but nobody could fake that strength. A bear with mange? But the proportions were all wrong. Nobody said the word Bigfoot, but I know we were all thinking it. I wish that had been the end of it. Just a strange, one-time sighting that we could eventually convince ourselves had a rational explanation. But what happened about 6 weeks later was worse, much worse. It was early November, and Roy had gone out to the property alone to fix some things in the barn before winter set in. He called me that night, and I could tell from his voice something was wrong. He asked me to come over, said he needed to talk in person. When I got to his house, he was sitting at his kitchen table with a glass of whiskey, which was unusual for him. He looked pale, and there was a large scrape on his cheek. "What happened?" I asked, sitting down across from him. Roy took a deep breath. "I was at the property, working in the barn until dusk. I had my toolbox with me, fixing that broken hinge on the big door. I was just finishing up, about to head back to the truck when..." He paused, took another sip of whiskey. Something hit me from behind. Hard, like I got tackled by a linebacker. Knocked me face first into the dirt so hard my toolbox went flying, tools scattered everywhere. I noticed then that his clothes were dirty, his jeans torn at the knee. I couldn't breathe for a second, he continued. The wind was completely knocked out of me, and there was this smell, like rotting meat mixed with skunk spray, so strong it made my eyes water. "Did you see what hit you?" I asked. He shook his head. "No." By the time I could roll over and look, whatever it was had disappeared into the trees, but I heard it moving through the underbrush, heavy footsteps, branches breaking, moving fast for something so big. "You think it was the same thing we saw in September?" I asked quietly. Roy nodded slowly. "Has to be. And here's the thing, Tom. I've been talking to Jeff, the guy who owned the land before me. After what we saw, I called him up, just fishing for information, you know? He told me some stories that he'd never mentioned when I bought the place. According to Roy, Jeff's wife had been alone in their trailer on the property one evening when something started violently shaking the entire structure. She thought it was an earthquake at first, until she realized something was literally rocking the trailer back and forth. She was too terrified to look outside. Another time, Jeff himself was hunting on the property when something chased him through the woods. He said he was running full sprint, and whatever was behind him was keeping pace easily, crashing through the underbrush. He only escaped by diving into his truck and locking the doors. "And get this," Roy said, leaning forward. "Jeff said these things only ever happened in the fall, September through November. Every year." I felt a chill run through me. "What does that mean? Like it's migrating or something?" "I don't know, but there's more. Remember last October when I was bow hunting alone and came back looking like I'd seen a ghost? I told everyone I just got spooked by some coyotes." I nodded. I remembered that day clearly. Roy had practically sprinted back to the cabin, wide-eyed and pale. That wasn't coyotes. I was in my tree stand when I heard something moving nearby. About 30 yards away, this thing, the same thing we saw. It was thrashing at trees, breaking branches, shaking entire trunks like it was angry or marking territory. I sat completely still for almost 2 hours before I finally worked up the courage to climb down and get the hell out of there. We talked until well past midnight. The more we discussed it, the more certain we became that something was using Roy's land as part of its territory during the fall months. Something that didn't want us there. Over the next few weeks, we set up trail cameras around the property, hoping to catch evidence of whatever was out there. But strangely, every camera we put up either malfunctioned, was found smashed, or had its memory card corrupted. All except one, which captured a single blurry image of something large moving between trees at night. The photo was too indistinct to prove anything, but the outline was unmistakably bipedal and massive. The final straw came in late November. Roy and I had gone to check the property one last time, before winter fully set in. We were being cautious, carrying sidearms and staying together. Everything seemed normal until we approached the barn. The heavy wooden door, the same one Roy had been fixing when he was attacked, had been completely torn off its hinges, not just broken, but ripped away with such force that the metal hardware was bent and twisted. Inside, Roy's workbench had been overturned, tools scattered everywhere, and on the dirt floor were footprints, huge, human-like footprints that measured nearly 16 inches long. That was the last time either of us went to the property alone. Roy listed it for sale the following spring, disclosing nothing about our experiences to the new owners. I've often wondered if they've experienced the same things we did when September rolled around. I've spoken to a few local wildlife experts, trying to find some rational explanation for what we encountered, but nothing fits. Black bears don't behave that way. No known animal matches the description or behavior pattern. The only consistent explanation is one I'm still uncomfortable saying out loud. Whatever it was, it seems to have a pattern, returning to certain territories during specific months, displaying territorial behavior, and apparently growing more aggressive when its warnings are ignored. I've since learned that Harford County has a long history of similar sightings going back decades, though most go unreported because people fear ridicule. The new owner contacted Roy last year, asking some pointed questions about whether he'd ever noticed anything unusual on the property during the fall months. Roy played dumb, but later told me the guy sounded shaken. So whatever's out there, it's still following its seasonal pattern, still patrolling those 68 acres every September through November, still making its presence known. I haven't been back to those woods since that day at the barn. I don't plan to, especially not in autumn. Some things are better left alone, and whatever stalks those woods in the fall is definitely one of them. Story 7. I've hunted all my life. Started when I was just a kid with my dad, probably around 7 or 8 years old. By the time I hit 43 in 2003, I figured there wasn't much in the Florida backwoods that could surprise me anymore. I was dead wrong. This happened in early November, when the weather had finally cooled down enough to make hunting bearable again. I'd taken a few days off work to do some solo hunting in the Green Swamp Wilderness, been going there for years, knew it pretty well, or at least I thought I did. That morning was crisp by Florida standards, maybe 55 degrees, perfect hunting weather. I parked my truck at one of the smaller access points off a dirt road, grabbed my .36 and headed in before sunrise. I was after deer, maybe wild hog if I got lucky. The light was just starting to filter through the cypress trees, making that golden green glow that only happens in the swamp at dawn. I'd been moving slowly for about 2 hours, following game trails and keeping the wind in my face. The swamp was doing its usual morning thing, birds calling, insects buzzing, the occasional splash from something in the water. Nothing unusual. Around 9 o'clock, I came across a section where the trail dipped near a cypress dome. The ground was getting soggy, so I veered off to skirt around the wet area. That's when I spotted them. Tracks. But not deer tracks, not hog tracks, not even bear tracks, which would have been unusual enough in that area. These were footprints, human-looking, except they weren't human at all. I've been a hunter long enough to know what human tracks looked like. These were similar but all wrong. They were bare feet impressions in the soft earth, but massive, easily twice the length of my own boot print, and I wear a size 11. These were maybe 16, 17 inches long and extraordinarily wide. You could see the toe impressions clearly, 5 toes, spread out wide, pressed deep into the mud. The stride between them was huge too, like 4 feet apart. No human walks like that. I felt this cold tingle run up my spine. In all my years in these woods, I'd never seen anything like this. Sure, I'd heard stories around campfires about the skunk ape or Florida Bigfoot, but always laughed them off as tall tales. Nobody who knows these swamps believes that stuff. At least, that's what I thought. Something about those tracks made me forget about deer hunting altogether. They were fresh, maybe an hour old at most. The edges were still sharp, not rounded by moisture. Whatever made them had come through recently. I should have turned around right then. That would have been the smart play. Instead, I did the dumbest thing possible. I started following them. The tracks led deeper into a dense section of palmettos and scrub oak, the kind of thick, nasty stuff most hunters avoid. It was slow going, having to push through the sore palmettos that tore at my clothes. The whole time, those massive footprints continued, perfectly spaced, moving with purpose through terrain I was struggling with. After following for maybe 20 minutes, I realized something had changed. The swamp had gone quiet. Not just quiet, silent. No birds, no insects, nothing. Anyone who spends time in the outdoors knows what that means. Something was wrong. Something had scared everything else into silence. I stopped to listen, my heart suddenly pounding in my chest. That's when I heard it. A long, slow exhale behind me. The kind of breath that comes from something big. Really big. Then came a sound I'll never forget as long as I live. A deep, wet, gurgling growl that seemed to come from something with a chest bigger than a barrel. Every hair on my body stood straight up. I froze completely, not even daring to turn around. The sound wasn't like anything I'd ever heard. Not bear, not panther, not anything that should exist in Florida. It was primal and ancient and wrong. Very slowly, I started to back away, moving inch by inch, my rifle clutched so tight my knuckles were white. As I edged backward, movement caught my eye about 40 yards ahead through a gap in the vegetation. Something massive stepped partially into view. At first, my brain couldn't process what I was seeing. It was upright, standing on two legs like a man, but it was huge. 7, maybe 8 feet tall. It was covered in dark brown hair, not fur like a bear, but hair like coarse human hair, hanging in matted clumps from its body. Its arms were unnaturally long, hanging down almost to its knees, but it was the face that burned itself into my memory forever. What I could see of it was dark-skinned, flat, with a heavy brow ridge protruding over deep-set eyes and a broad, flat nose, almost human, but not human at all. And there was something wrong with its face. The left eye socket looked damaged, sunken in, the skin around it rough and scarred, like it had healed badly from some terrible injury. Its right eye, God, that eye, was fixed directly on me, dark, intelligent and absolutely aware. This wasn't an animal looking at me. This thing knew exactly what I was. For what felt like an eternity, we just stared at each other through the gaps in the palmettos. Then it did something that turned my blood to ice. It opened its mouth and let out a roar that seemed to shake the very air. It wasn't like a bear's roar or a lion's. It was deeper, more guttural and somehow angry. The sound echoed through the trees, bouncing back from all directions until it felt like it was coming from everywhere at once. My finger tensed on the trigger of my rifle, but some instinct told me shooting would be the worst mistake of my life. This thing was giving me a warning. It took one deliberate step forward, pushing aside a palmetto frond like it was nothing. The message was clear. It was controlling this encounter, not me. I started backing away, keeping my eyes on it as best I could through the vegetation. I didn't turn and run, though everything in me screamed to do just that. Instead, I kept backing up, one slow step at a time, moving toward where I thought the access road should be. The creature followed. Not rushing, not charging, just maintaining a steady pace behind me. I could hear it crashing through the underbrush, breaking branches that would have taken all my strength to snap. It was keeping its distance, maybe 30 yards back, but it was definitely following. This went on for what must have been 45 minutes, though it felt like hours. Me backing away, trying not to trip over roots or fall into sinkholes, and this massive one-eyed thing following behind, occasionally circling around so that the sounds came from different directions. Every few minutes, it would let out another one of those roars, sometimes closer, sometimes farther away, like it was reminding me it was still there. I'd gotten completely turned around, but finally broke through into a more open area and realized I'd somehow made it back toward the access road. As I stepped onto the gravel, the sounds of pursuit stopped. Just stopped completely. I stood there for maybe 5 minutes, my rifle ready, sweat pouring down my face despite the cool air. Nothing. The creature had gone, or at least had stopped following me. Gradually, the normal sounds of the swamp returned. A bird called somewhere nearby, then another answered. A few insects started buzzing again. I made it back to my truck in record time, threw my gear in the back, and got the hell out of there. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely get the key in the ignition. That was 19 years ago now. I've never told anyone about this, except my wife, who thinks I saw a bear standing on its hind legs. I've never gone back to that specific part of Green Swamp, though I still hunt other areas. I've spent countless hours researching since then. Read every account of Bigfoot or skunk ape sightings I could find. Most sound like bullshit, but a very few, sound exactly like what I experienced. The silence in the woods. The feeling of being watched. The way it follows, but keeps its distance. What haunts me most is that eye. That one good eye staring at me with what I can only describe as intelligent recognition, and the damaged eye socket, scarred and sunken. Whatever this thing was, it had been in fights before, had survived whatever took its eye. It wasn't afraid of humans. It was asserting its territory. It was escorting me out of its domain. Sometimes I wake up at night hearing that roar in my dreams. My wife says I mumble about the one eye in my sleep. I've never been able to explain exactly what happened that day. I just know that something impossible lives in those swamps. Something that survived there for who knows how long. Something that knows the territory better than any human ever could. And it's still out there, watching with its one good eye. Story 8. I still can't believe what happened to us last October. My husband Robert and I had been enjoying our little slice of heaven, an off-grid cabin we built ourselves on a secluded lake along the Oregon coast. We'd saved for years to buy this property, and we loved the isolation. No neighbors, no traffic noise, just us and nature. At least, that's what we thought. It was October 3rd, 2019. I remember the date clearly because we'd been celebrating our wedding anniversary the day before. We'd spent the day fishing and collecting mushrooms around the property. That evening was chilly but clear, and we were winding down for the night. Robert was reading one of his wilderness survival books while I was working on a crochet project I'd been neglecting for months. Our two Shih Tzus, Baxter and Milo, were curled up on the rug near the wood stove. It was peaceful. Normal. Around 10 o'clock, we heard it, a loud bang against the exterior wall near the kitchen. It wasn't like a branch falling or an animal scratching. This was deliberate, like someone had taken their fist and pounded on our wall. What the hell was that? I remember asking. Robert put his book down and grabbed the flashlight we keep by the door. Probably just a raccoon knocking over the recycling bin, he said, but I could tell by his voice he didn't believe that. Our recycling container was secured with bungee cords, specifically to prevent raccoons from getting in. Robert pulled on his boots and jacket and went outside to investigate. I stood at the window, watching his flashlight beam dance around the side of the cabin. After a few minutes, he came back in. "Nothing there," he said, hanging his jacket back on the hook. "Bins still secured. No tracks or anything unusual." We tried to settle back into our evening routine, but I couldn't focus on my crocheting anymore. The dogs seemed restless too, which was unusual for them. Typically, they'd be sound asleep by this time. Not even 10 minutes later, we heard it again. Bang! This time it was louder, more forceful, and definitely from the same spot on the wall. The dogs immediately jumped up and started pacing, but strangely, they weren't barking. In fact, they were completely silent, which was very unlike them. "Turn off the lights," Robert said. "The glare on the windows is making it impossible to see outside." I switched off the lamps while Robert moved toward the bedroom window, which faced the back of our property where we keep our generator shed. The shed has a small solar-powered light that stays on throughout the night. I followed him, my heart racing. That's when we saw it. Standing partially illuminated by the shed's light, about 20 feet from our cabin, was something I still have trouble describing. It was enormous, a massive figure standing upright. At first, my brain tried to make sense of it. Was it a bear, a person in a coat? But no, this was something else entirely. Robert grabbed my arm, his fingers digging into my skin. We both froze, barely breathing. I only looked at it for a few seconds before I had to turn away. My body was literally shaking. I backed into the hallway, but Robert stayed at the window, staring. "Linda," he whispered, "are you seeing this?" but I couldn't go back to the window. I just couldn't. I heard Milo whimper, and then I noticed a puddle forming under him. He was so terrified he'd peed right there on our hardwood floor. Both dogs had pressed themselves against the wall in the hallway, as far from the windows as they could get. From the bedroom, Robert was providing a running commentary in a hushed, tense voice. It's just standing there, looking at the cabin. God, it must be over 8 feet tall. It's covered in hair, reddish brown, like a redwood tree. I gathered my courage and peeked around the corner. Robert was completely still, transfixed by whatever was outside our window. I took 2 steps forward and forced myself to look. The creature was still there, motionless except for slight movements of its head, as if it was studying our cabin. Now that my eyes had adjusted to the darkness, I could make out more details. Its face wasn't like anything I'd ever seen, a flat profile with a huge brow ridge that shadowed its eyes. Its mouth was wide with what looked like blocky teeth partially visible, and its nose was broad and flat against its face. The proportions were all wrong for a human, yet it stood perfectly upright, confident in its posture. What struck me most was its expression. It didn't look aggressive or angry. It looked curious, like it was trying to understand what our cabin was, or maybe what we were. For about 2 minutes, though it felt like hours, the creature stood there. Then, with deliberate slowness, it turned and walked back toward the woods. The way it moved was so distinctive, swinging its arms with a fluid motion as it shifted its weight from one leg to the other. There was nothing awkward about its movement. It moved with purpose and awareness. As soon as it disappeared into the tree line, I burst into tears. The tension that had been building inside me just broke. Robert put his arms around me, and I could feel him trembling too. What the hell was that? I kept asking. What the hell was that? I think we just saw a Sasquatch, Robert finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. Now, I need to pause here and say that neither Robert nor I were believers before this. We joke about Bigfoot whenever we see those silly tourist traps along the highway. We're practical people. I'm a retired nurse, and Robert worked in construction his whole life. We deal in reality, not fantasy, but what we saw that night was real. There's no other explanation that fits. We were both too scared to stay in the cabin. Robert grabbed his rifle from the gun safe, and I took my .38 revolver. Not that we intended to shoot the creature, we just needed some sense of security. The dogs were still huddled together, shaking, and we had to practically drag them to the truck. We activated the panic alarm on our truck as we left, hoping the noise would keep the creature away from our property. We drove nearly an hour to reach the nearest motel, barely speaking the whole way. What was there to say? We'd both seen something impossible. We barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure standing in our yard, its eyes seeming to look right through our walls. The next morning, we returned cautiously. It felt strange seeing our cabin in the daylight, so normal, so unthreatening. But the memory of the previous night hung over everything. Robert immediately went to the window where we'd seen the creature and started making measurements. Based on the window height and the shed light position, he calculated that whatever we saw had been about 8.5 feet tall. Just thinking about that made me feel sick to my stomach. We searched the area where it had stood, hoping to find footprints, but our yard is mostly packed sand and moss, not great for leaving impressions. We did notice some crushed ferns and disturbed mushrooms along what would have been its path back to the woods. And when we checked the recycling bin, we found it had been dislodged slightly from its usual position, despite the bungee cords. We figured that's what caused the banging. The creature had been investigating the plastic container. The dogs refused to go outside all day. These are animals that normally love exploring the property, but they wouldn't set foot outside the door. Even now, months later, they get anxious whenever we take them to the cabin. For weeks afterward, I had trouble sleeping. Every little sound outside made me think it had returned. Robert installed motion sensor lights all around the property and set up trail cameras, but we haven't captured anything unusual since that night. We've told only a few close friends about what happened, and most of them think we're either lying or that we saw a bear. But a bear doesn't stand 8 feet tall on its hind legs and walk away with the confidence of a person. A bear doesn't have a face with human-like features, and a bear wouldn't have terrified our dogs into silence. I don't know why it was near our cabin that night. Maybe it was just curious about the lights or the smells. Maybe our property is on some ancient path it follows. All I know is that I saw something that shouldn't exist according to science, yet it does. We still use our cabin, but never alone anymore. We always have friends visit with us, and we never stay past dark if we can help it. Robert wants to reach out to Bigfoot researchers, but I've resisted. I don't want our peaceful retreat to become some circus with people tramping through the woods looking for monsters. Sometimes I find myself staring into the trees surrounding our property, wondering if it's out there watching us, wondering if it'll come back, wondering what would have happened if it had decided to do more than just bang on our wall. The Oregon woods don't feel the same to me anymore. There's something out there, something intelligent that knows we're here too. And that knowledge has changed everything. Story 9. I've never told this story to many people. Most think I'm crazy or making it up, but I swear on everything I hold dear that what I'm about to share is the God's honest truth. It happened back in August of 1960 when I was 16. I was pretty good at rodeo competitions back then, and through that I'd met some native guys from British Columbia, Jim, Kid, and Earl. They asked if I wanted to join them on a canoe hunting expedition to get some winter meat. Being young and stupid, of course I said yes. We planned to launch from near Horsley, east of Williams Lake, and head north and east through a bunch of lakes and rivers. We didn't take much with us, just the bare essentials. 2 20-foot freighter canoes packed with only what we absolutely needed. The idea was to live off the land, hunting and fishing for our food along the way. I was excited. This was real wilderness adventure stuff, you know? The first 2 days were pretty uneventful. Just paddling, setting up camp, fishing a bit. Nothing special. But on the 3rd day, we spotted a young moose and managed to shoot it. It wasn't huge, but it would give us plenty of meat. We beached the canoes and got to work processing it, hanging most of the meat up to dry into jerky. We planned to smoke it overnight before continuing our journey. That's when things started getting weird. While we were working on the moose, 3 canoes came around the bend. They carried native people, 2 men, 3 women, and a couple of kids. They didn't speak any English, at least not in front of me. Jim and the others could communicate with them somewhat, but I couldn't understand a word. They seemed friendly enough, though. We shared some of our fresh moose meat with them and gave them some flour, tea, and tobacco. They stayed for maybe an hour. Just before they left, I heard one of the women say something that sounded like Sasquatch twice, and then she laughed. I figured she was just joking around. I'd heard stories about Bigfoot and Sasquatch before, but I never put much stock in them. They were just campfire tales to scare kids, right? After they left, we finished with the moose meat and packed up to continue our journey. We paddled for several more hours before making camp that evening. We found a nice flat area under some tall trees by a river. The river wasn't huge, maybe 40 to 60 feet wide, but it was flowing pretty good. We set up our 2 tents, got a fire going, and cooked some fresh moose steaks. Everything was perfect. We ate well, told some stories around the fire, and turned in early, exhausted from the day's work. I was dead asleep when it happened. I'm guessing it was around 2 or 3 in the morning when a tremendous crash woke us all up. It sounded like something had exploded in our camp. I shot up, heart pounding, completely disoriented. Jim was already scrambling out of our tent, and I followed him. What I saw made no sense. Our Dutch oven and cookbox were completely demolished. scattered and broken like they'd been hit by a wrecking ball, and right in the middle of the destruction was a rock, not just any rock, but a boulder the size of a bowling ball. "What the hell?" Kid muttered as he joined us. We were all standing there trying to make sense of what had happened when another crash came from behind us. We spun around to see our other tent now had a massive hole in it. Earl was cursing and stumbling out of the damaged tent. Another boulder, about the same size as the first, had come straight down through the trees and torn through the canvas. "Is everyone okay?" Jim called out, and we all nodded, still too shocked to say much. Then came the sound. A weird, high-pitched hooting from across the river. It wasn't like any animal I'd ever heard before. Not a bird, not a coyote, nothing I could recognize. It echoed through the trees, sending chills up my spine. "We need to get out of here," Earl said, grabbing his rifle. But before we could move, another boulder came crashing down, missing Kid by maybe 3 feet. That's when I realized these weren't just falling, they were being thrown from across the river. We grabbed our rifles and huddled behind one of the canoes, using it as a shield. The hooting continued, sometimes sounding like it was moving along the opposite bank. Every few minutes, another rock would come flying into our camp. Some small, some big, all of them potentially deadly if they hit any of us. I've never been so terrified in my life. We couldn't see what was throwing the rocks because it was pitch black across the river. We fired a few warning shots, but that just seemed to anger whatever it was. The rocks came faster after that. We stayed huddled behind those canoes for what felt like an eternity. None of us dared to move. The hooting eventually stopped, but the rocks kept coming, less frequently but still dangerous. I remember looking at my watch around 4:30 and wondering if we'd survive until daylight. As the sky finally began to lighten, the attacks stopped. We waited another hour after the last rock before cautiously emerging from our hiding spot. What we found in the daylight was unbelievable. There were 9 rocks scattered throughout our campsite, ranging from bowling ball to beach ball size. The largest one, I swear on my life, must have weighed between 150 and 200 pounds. It had crushed one of our canoe's seats. Our tent was shredded, cooking equipment destroyed. Miraculously, the canoes themselves weren't badly damaged, just that one seat. "What could throw something that big?" I asked, my voice shaking as I stared at the massive boulder. None of them answered. They were looking at the ground, at the trees, at the river, anywhere but at me or that boulder. They knew something I didn't, but nobody was talking. Then Kid said, "We need to check the meat." The blood drained from my face. In all the chaos, I'd forgotten about the moose meat we'd hung to smoke overnight about 50 yards from our camp. We grabbed our rifles and cautiously made our way to where we'd left the meat. What we found, or rather what we didn't find, made my stomach drop. Everything was gone, not just the meat, but the logs we'd used to hang it, the rope, even the remains of the carcass we'd kept for broth. There wasn't a trace left. Not a scrap of meat, not a drop of blood, nothing. "It took everything," Earl whispered, his face ashen. "What did?" I demanded, my voice cracking. "What the hell is going on?" Jim finally looked me in the eye. "Sasquatch," he said simply. I wanted to laugh. I wanted to tell him he was crazy, but I couldn't. Not after what I'd seen. Not after watching boulders that would take 2 or 3 men to lift come flying through the air like they were softballs. We didn't discuss it further. We didn't need to. Without a word, we packed what little remained of our gear and got those canoes in the water. We paddled like our lives depended on it, because we all believed they did. We didn't stop until well into the afternoon, and even then, it was only because our arms were about to give out. That night, we didn't make camp on land. We tied the canoes together and spent the night floating in the middle of a lake, taking turns keeping watch. None of us slept much. It's been over 60 years since that night, and I still have nightmares about it, about those hooting sounds, about rocks flying through the darkness, about something powerful enough to throw a 150-pound boulder across a 50-foot stream. I've tried to rationalize it over the years. Maybe it was some kind of freak landslide. Maybe some local kids playing a prank. Maybe we were all hallucinating from some bad berries we ate. But deep down, I know none of those explanations make sense. 5 things I know for certain. 1. Those rocks weren't on the bank when we arrived. 2. They were thrown, not carried or rolled. 3. No human could have done what we experienced. I never want to return to that area again. Something out there threw a boulder that weighed as much as a grown man across a river, and I still can't explain how or why. I'm not asking anyone to believe me. Most don't, but when people talk about Bigfoot or Sasquatch around me, I don't laugh anymore, because I know there's something out there in those woods. Something that didn't want us there. Something that made sure we knew it. And the most terrifying part, it could have killed us if it wanted to. Those rocks came close, but never hit any of us directly. It was warning us, telling us to leave its territory, and we did. I've never told the full story to many people. My wife knows. My kids think it's just an old man's tall tale. But now you know too. Make of it what you will. But if you're ever camping in the remote wilderness of British Columbia and hear strange hooting in the night, don't wait until morning. Get out. Get out as fast as you can, because sometimes the old legends are true, and sometimes they're hunting you. Story 10 to the power of, I can't believe I'm finally writing this down after all these years. This happened in the summer of '88 when I was 23. I've only told a handful of people about it, and most just give me that look. You know the one. Like I'm either making it up or was just hearing things. But I know what I heard that night on Palomar Mountain, and it still bothers me to this day. My girlfriend Lisa and I had planned this camping trip with our friends Mark and Jen. None of us were experienced campers, but we were young and wanted to get away from the city for a weekend. Mark found this spot on Palomar Mountain that was supposedly beautiful, but not crowded like the main campgrounds. It was technically a designated camping area, but it was one of those primitive spots with no facilities, just a fire ring and a flat area for tents, about a quarter-mile off a dirt access road. We drove up on a Friday afternoon in my beat-up Toyota pickup. The spot was even more secluded than we expected. The nearest other campsite was at least half a mile away, and we didn't see anyone else the entire drive in. The area was gorgeous, though. Tall pines, oak trees, and this amazing view of the valley below when you walked about 50 yards from our campsite to this little clearing. The first night was great. We grilled burgers, drank beer, told stupid stories around the campfire. Typical camping stuff. Mark had brought his guitar and played some Eagles songs badly. We all crashed around midnight. Everything was completely normal. The next morning, Mark got a call on his car phone, remember those giant brick phones from the '80s, that there was some family emergency. Nothing serious, but they needed to head back to San Diego. Lisa and I decided to stay for the second night since we'd already set up our tent and everything. After Mark and Jen left around noon, Lisa and I hiked around the area for a few hours. It was hot, probably in the high 80s. But beautiful under the tree canopy. We found a small stream about a mile from camp and sat there for a while. That's when I first started feeling off. I can't really explain it properly. It wasn't like I heard or saw anything specific. It was just this crawling sensation on the back of my neck, like when you feel someone staring at you in a crowded room. I kept looking around, scanning the trees, but there was nothing there. Lisa didn't notice anything and thought I was being paranoid when I mentioned it. We headed back to camp around 4 in the afternoon, and the feeling got stronger. I remember stopping several times on the trail, convinced I'd heard something moving parallel to us through the brush. But whenever I stopped to listen, there was nothing, just birds and the wind. Back at camp, I tried to shake it off. We made an early dinner as the sun was starting to get lower. The whole time, I couldn't stop looking at the tree line around our campsite. Our spot was in a small clearing, maybe 40 feet across, surrounded by dense pine and oak. Perfect for privacy, but suddenly it felt like those trees were hiding something. "You're being weird today," Lisa said while we ate. "What's up with you?" I didn't want to freak her out, so I just blamed it on being tired from the hike, but I couldn't stop scanning the woods. The feeling of being watched was so intense by then that it was hard to focus on anything else. As it got dark, we built up the fire, but I found myself using way more wood than necessary, making it bigger and brighter than we needed. Lisa noticed and teased me about being afraid of the dark, but there was something about having that light that made me feel marginally safer. Around 10, Lisa was getting tired and headed to the tent. I stayed by the fire, telling her I wanted to finish my beer first. The truth was, I didn't want to be in that dark tent. Out by the fire, I could at least see a little way into the woods. After Lisa fell asleep, I finally forced myself to go to the tent around 11:30. I remember checking that our tent was zipped up tight, which seems so pointless in retrospect, like a zipper would protect us from whatever was out there. I laid down next to Lisa, who was already fast asleep, but I couldn't even close my eyes. The feeling of wrongness was overwhelming. Our tent was one of those cheap department store tents, thin nylon walls that did nothing to block sound. The night was completely silent, except for Lisa's soft breathing and the occasional crack from the dying campfire. The moon was new, so once the fire died down, it was pitch black. I couldn't see my hand in front of my face inside that tent. I don't know exactly what time it was, maybe 1 in the morning when it happened. I was still wide awake, staring into the darkness when I heard it. Footsteps. Fast, heavy footsteps coming through the woods toward our campsite. At first I thought maybe it was a deer. We'd seen plenty of them during the day, but these weren't the sounds of a 4-legged animal. This was bipedal, 2 legs running hard and fast. The footfalls were heavy, like someone big wearing boots, but too quick for normal walking. It was a run or a very fast jog. The sound came from the north side of our campsite, crashing through the underbrush. Whatever it was moving in a straight line, not trying to be quiet at all. It wasn't sneaking, it was in a hurry. I remember freezing completely. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Lisa was still asleep somehow, and I didn't dare wake her. What would I say? What would we do? The footsteps entered our clearing about 20 feet from our tent. I could hear them clearly on the pine needles and hard dirt. They didn't slow down at all, just charged straight through our campsite at the same steady, rapid pace. No flashlight, no light of any kind. Whatever it was running through absolute darkness. The strangest part was that it made no other sound, no breathing, no talking, no sounds of clothes rustling, just those heavy, rhythmic footfalls. They crossed the clearing in seconds and continued into the woods on the other side, gradually fading away as whatever it was moved deeper into the forest. I lay there for what felt like hours, listening. I kept expecting it to come back, to circle around, but there was nothing, just silence. I didn't sleep at all that night. I kept my pocket knife clutched in my hand until dawn, though what good a 3-inch blade would do against whatever was out there, I don't know. It was stupid bravado, but it made me feel marginally better. When the first light finally came around 5:30 in the morning, I unzipped the tent and looked outside. The campsite looked exactly as we'd left it. Our cooler was untouched. Nothing was disturbed. I walked around the entire clearing, looking for footprints or broken branches. Anything. But the ground was mostly hard-packed dirt and pine needles, not the kind of surface that would easily show tracks. Lisa woke up around 7, completely oblivious to what had happened. I debated whether to tell her, but decided against it. We were leaving in a few hours anyway, and I didn't want to scare her. I made up an excuse about wanting to get back early to beat traffic, and we packed up faster than we normally would have. As we were loading the truck, I took one last look at the woods where the thing had disappeared. In the daylight, it was just trees again. Beautiful, peaceful. But I couldn't shake the memory of those footsteps. On the drive home, I tried to rationalize what I'd heard. Could it have been a person? Maybe some hiker who got lost and was running to find his campsite. But who hikes without a light in the pitch black? And why run straight through an obviously occupied campsite without saying anything? It made no sense. A bear? No way. Bears don't run on two legs for extended distances. A deer? Definitely not. Bipedal mountain lion? Same problem, plus they move quietly, not crashing through the underbrush. The footsteps I heard were human-like, but bigger somehow. Heavier. And the stride length was wrong. Too long for a normal person, especially someone running in complete darkness through unfamiliar terrain. I've replayed that night in my head thousands of times over the years. I've read about other people's experiences in remote areas, looking for something similar. I've even read about Bigfoot sightings in the Palomar Mountain area, though I've never been the type to believe in that sort of thing. But whatever ran through our campsite that night wasn't normal. It wasn't human, at least not in the conventional sense. And it knew we were there, had to have seen our tent. But it didn't care. We weren't its target or its interest. We were just in its path. I never went back to Palomar Mountain after that. I sold my camping gear the following year. Lisa and I broke up a few months later for unrelated reasons, and I never told her what happened that night. It's been 35 years, and I still get that same crawling sensation on my neck sometimes when I'm alone in the dark. I still find myself scanning tree lines when I'm in wooded areas, looking for something watching from the shadows. The rational part of my brain says it was probably just some weirdo hiker. The part of me that was there that night, that heard those footsteps tear through our campsite in the pitch black, knows better. Whatever it wasn't lost, and it wasn't human. And the most terrifying part is that I'm certain it wasn't alone out there. That feeling of being watched started hours before the footsteps. Something was observing us, tracking us, and maybe the runner was just passing through, but I can't shake the feeling that it was delivering a message to whatever else was out there in those woods. A message about us. Story 11. I've been a hunter for most of my life, but what happened last November in East Texas still keeps me up at night. I've gone back and forth about sharing this for months now, but I need to get it off my chest. I'm not looking for anyone to believe me. Honestly, I wouldn't believe it myself if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes. My Uncle Terry and I were tracking a deer that my cousin Jake had shot the evening before. Jake had to leave early for work, so we promised to find his deer and process it for him. It was around 7 in the morning, cold and foggy, typical East Texas autumn weather. We were about a mile into the woods following a blood trail that kept disappearing in the fallen leaves. The property belongs to my uncle's friend, about 80 acres of dense pine and oak woodland with a creek running through it. We've been hunting there for years without incident. I knew every trail and landmark on that property, or at least I thought I did. We split up to cover more ground, staying within shouting distance of each other. I was working my way down toward the creek when I heard Terry call out to me. His voice had this weird edge to it that immediately put me on alert. "Thomas, get over here! There's a damn gorilla in this tree watching me!" I remember rolling my eyes, thinking he was just messing with me. Terry's always been a bit of a jokester, especially during hunting trips. I figured he was trying to get me to run over so he could laugh at me. "Yeah, right," I called back. "And I just saw Bigfoot taking a bath in the creek. I'm serious, Thomas. Get your ass over here now." Something in his voice made the hair on my neck stand up. I'd never heard Terry sound scared before, and that's exactly what I was hearing. Fear. I made my way to him as quickly as I could, my rifle ready. When I reached him, he was standing stock still, staring up at a massive oak tree about 100 yards away. "Look through your scope," he whispered, not taking his eyes off the tree. "Tell me what you see." I raised my rifle and peered through the scope, adjusting it to focus on the fork of the oak tree where two massive branches split from the trunk. What I saw made my blood run cold. There was someone, standing perfectly upright in the fork of that tree. At first, my brain tried to make sense of it. A hunter in a ghillie suit? But the coloration was wrong. A deep orange-brown hair covered most of its body, and the way it was standing, completely upright in the tree fork without holding on to anything for balance. It was just standing there, watching us. I adjusted my scope to get a better look at its face. The hair thinned out around the eyes and mouth, revealing dark skin beneath. The eyes were what got me, dark and deeply set, but unmistakably intelligent, human-like, but not human at all. "Do you see it?" Terry whispered. "Yeah," I managed to reply, my mouth suddenly bone dry. "What the hell is that thing?" "I don't know, but I've been watching it for about 5 minutes. It hasn't moved once." I estimated it was about 6 feet tall, maybe taller. The proportions were all wrong for a human. Longer arms, broader shoulders, and the stillness. No human could stand that still for that long, especially balanced in a tree fork 20 feet off the ground. "Should we approach it?" I asked, not taking my eye away from the scope. "I think we should," Terry replied. "Surprising me. We need to know what we're dealing with here." We started walking toward the tree, moving slowly, our rifles ready. I kept glancing through my scope every few steps. The creature remained motionless, watching us approach. When we were about 50 yards away, something changed. I looked through my scope again, and the tree fork was empty. The thing had vanished without making a sound. "Where did it go?" I hissed, scanning the surrounding trees. Terry pointed to the base of the oak. "Look there." We approached cautiously. At the base of the tree were 2 deep impressions in the soft earth, heel prints, like something heavy had landed there from above. The prints were huge, easily twice the size of my boot, and sunk several inches into the ground. Whatever made those prints was heavy, much heavier than a human. And then the smell hit us. It was like nothing I'd ever encountered before, a powerful, sour, musky odor that made my eyes water. It reminded me of wet dog, rotting meat, and something else I couldn't identify, something wild. "Jesus," Terry muttered, covering his nose with his sleeve. "You smell that?" I nodded, trying not to gag. The smell seemed to cling to the inside of my nostrils, making it hard to breathe. We scanned the surrounding woods, and that's when I spotted movement, about 300 yards away. 2 dark figures moving between the trees, heading deeper into the forest. They were moving fast, covering ground in a way that seemed impossible given the dense underbrush. "You see that?" I whispered, pointing. Terry nodded, raising his binoculars. "There's 2 of them now." We watched in silence as the figures disappeared into the thicker part of the woods. I was trembling, partly from fear and partly from the adrenaline pumping through my system. "Before I called you over," Terry said quietly, "I saw something else. There was a smaller one in the same tree, maybe a female. It moved away when it saw me looking." "What are you saying, that we just saw a family of... what, Bigfoot?" Terry shrugged, but his face was pale. "I don't know what to call them. I've been hunting these woods for 30 years, and I've never seen anything like that." We stood there for a good 20 minutes, watching the tree line where the figures had disappeared. Part of me wanted to follow them, to get proof of what we'd seen. The smarter part of me knew that would be incredibly dangerous. "We should get back to finding Jake's deer," I finally said, trying to sound normal despite the fear still coursing through me. Terry nodded, seemingly relieved to focus on something familiar. "Yeah, let's do that." We continued our search, but everything felt different now. Every shadow, every rustle in the underbrush made us jump. We kept our rifles ready and stayed close together. After about an hour, we finally found the deer near the creek, just as we'd expected. It was a decent 8-point buck, and under normal circumstances, we would have been thrilled. But we worked quickly and silently, field dressing it and preparing to drag it back to the truck. The whole time, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The forest seemed unnaturally quiet. No birds, no squirrels, just the sound of our own breathing and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. We started the long drag back to the truck, taking turns pulling the deer. It was heavy work, and we had to stop frequently to rest. During one of these breaks, I glanced back toward the direction of the oak tree where we'd seen the creature. My heart nearly stopped. Standing beside the tree, not in it this time, but next to it, was what appeared to be the same creature. Even from this distance, I could make out its upright posture and orange-brown hair. It was just watching us. "Terry," I whispered, nodding in the direction of the figure. He saw it too, and muttered something under his breath that might have been a prayer. "Let's get out of here," he said, grabbing the deer's antlers and starting to drag it again with renewed urgency. We moved as quickly as we could, but dragging a 200-pound deer through the woods isn't exactly a speedy process. Every time I looked back, the figure was still there, sometimes closer, sometimes farther away, but always watching. When we finally reached the truck, we loaded the deer in record time. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely help. As we drove away, neither of us spoke for a long time. Finally, Terry broke the silence. "We don't tell anyone about this." "Not even Jake?" I asked. Especially not Jake. He'd never believe us anyway. He was right. Who would believe a story about bipedal, tree-climbing creatures in the East Texas woods? We'd sound crazy. But I knew what I'd seen, and so did Terry. I couldn't leave it alone, though. A week later, I went back to the property alone. Stupid, I know. I set up a trail camera near that same oak tree, hiding it as best I could. I didn't tell Terry or anyone else. 2 weeks later, I went back to retrieve the camera. The memory card was full of the usual deer, raccoons, and other wildlife. But there was one image taken at 2:17 in the morning that made my blood run cold. It was blurry and dark, but unmistakable, a tall, upright figure moving past the camera. The orange-brown hair, the proportions, the eyes reflecting the infrared light. It was the same creature we'd seen. I deleted the image immediately. I don't know why. Fear, maybe, or the knowledge that no one would believe it was real anyway. I haven't been back to those woods since, and I've made excuses every time Terry or Jake has invited me hunting. Some nights, I wake up in a cold sweat. The image of that creature standing in the tree fork burned into my memory. The intelligent eyes watching me. The impossible stillness. The way it moved through the woods faster than any human could. I don't know what we saw that day. I don't want to know. But I do know this. There are things in the woods of East Texas that shouldn't exist. Things that don't fit into our understanding of the world. And sometimes it's better not to look too closely at the shadows between the trees. I still have the trail camera. Sometimes I think about setting it up again, getting better evidence. But then I remember the smell and those eyes watching us, and I put the camera back in my closet. Some questions are better left unanswered. Story 12. I've been hesitant to share this for years. Most people hear Bigfoot and immediately think you're crazy or making things up for attention. But I know what I experienced, and I can't explain it any other way. I'm still processing everything that happened between 2005 and 2010 on my property in Northern Ferry County, Washington. I moved here in 1996, drawn to the isolation and the wilderness. My property backs up against national forest land, with miles of untouched forest stretching beyond my backyard. I've always considered myself level-headed. I work in construction, hunt regularly, and know these woods better than most. I'm not someone who jumps at shadows or makes up stories. It started in March 2005. I was up late watching TV, around 1 in the morning, when I heard something outside that made the hair on my neck stand up. It was this deep, resonant sound, somewhere between a moan and a growl, coming from the hill in front of my house. It wasn't a bear or a cougar. I've heard those plenty of times living out here. This was different, lower, more powerful, almost like it was made by something with a much larger chest cavity than any animal I knew lived in these woods. I stepped onto my porch and listened, but it had stopped. The forest was completely silent. No crickets, no owls, nothing. That unnatural silence was almost as unsettling as the sound itself. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The next day, I mentioned it to my dad, who's lived in the Pacific Northwest his whole life. As soon as I described the sound, he got this serious look on his face and said, "Mike, that sounds like a Sasquatch call." I laughed it off at first, but something about his certainty stuck with me. Nothing else happened for nearly 3 years. I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it or misidentified some known animal sound. Then came February 2008. We'd had a heavy snowfall, about 13 inches on the ground. I decided to hike up the same hill where I'd heard the sound years earlier. About a mile in, I froze in my tracks. There in the pristine snow were footprints. Not animal tracks, footprints. They were bare feet, human-shaped but massive. I wear a size 13 boot, and these prints dwarfed mine. I'd estimate they were size 16 or 17 at least. What really got me was the stride length. 4 to 5 feet between steps. I'm 6'2", and I had to stretch to match the distance between prints. I followed them for about half a mile before they disappeared into a thicket of trees, too dense for me to follow. I took photos with the disposable camera I had in my pack, but when I got them developed, they didn't show the depth and size clearly enough to convince anyone who wasn't there. Later that year, on August 18th, I was driving home on the back road that winds through the forest. It was around 8:30 in the evening, still light enough to see but getting dusky. That's when I heard it again, that same moan growl from 3 years earlier. I immediately pulled my truck over and cut the engine. The sound continued for 4 or 5 minutes, echoing through the trees. It was coming from the ridge to my right, maybe a quarter mile away. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel. It wasn't fear exactly, more like a surge of adrenaline and disbelief. I was finally hearing it again, confirming I hadn't imagined or misidentified it the first time. After these experiences, I couldn't ignore it anymore. I started spending more time in the woods, particularly around Mount Leona, where locals have reported strange happenings for generations. I'd hike out there on weekends with basic supplies, water, snacks, a small first aid kit, my camera, and sometimes a voice recorder. In late April 2009, everything changed. I was sitting at a switchback on a logging road I'd traveled many times, taking a break and having a sandwich, when I heard something that made me nearly choke on my food. It started as a single whoop from across the ridge, a loud, clear call that definitely wasn't a bird or any animal I recognized. Then came the response. Another whoop, similar but slightly different in pitch, from further up the ridge. Then a third from down near the creek. They were communicating, positioning themselves at different elevations. Some calls came from the ridge top, others from mid-ridge, and several from near the water below. I sat completely still for 2 hours, just listening. The calls weren't random. There was a pattern, a conversation happening. They would call in sequence, then pause, then start again with slight variations. I didn't dare move or try to record. Something told me any sudden movement would end the experience. When it got too dark to safely hike out, I reluctantly left, marking the location on my GPS. The entire drive home, my mind was racing. What I'd heard wasn't any known animal communication pattern I was familiar with. It was too complex, too intentional. I waited a week before returning to the same spot. This time, I brought my voice recorder and a better camera. I arrived around the same time, mid-afternoon, and waited. For the first hour, nothing happened. The forest was alive with normal sounds, birds, squirrels, the occasional distant sound of another vehicle on the main road miles away. Then I did something that still gives me chills to think about. I decided to try mimicking the calls I'd heard. I cupped my hands around my mouth and made my best attempt at that whooping sound. The response was immediate. A loud crack echoed through the forest, the unmistakable sound of something powerful striking a tree. It came from the switchback above me, maybe 100 yards away. Whatever made that sound had been there all along, watching me, waiting. I felt exposed, vulnerable, but also exhilarated. This wasn't random. Something had responded to me specifically. I started making weekly trips to the area. I'd read about researchers who had successfully habituated mountain gorillas in Africa by making regular, non-threatening visits. And I thought maybe a similar approach could work here. Each time, I'd sit at the same spot, sometimes calling out, sometimes just waiting quietly. The responses varied, sometimes wood knocks, sometimes distant calls, sometimes nothing at all. By early June, I was spending every free weekend in those woods. My wife thought I was losing it, becoming obsessed. Maybe I was, but something was out there, and it seemed to be growing accustomed to my presence. On June 21st, I arrived at my usual spot around 4 in the afternoon. It was a clear day, unseasonably warm. I set up my small camp chair and settled in with my notebook, documenting the time, weather conditions, and any wildlife I observed. My attempt at being scientific about all this. About an hour in, I heard rustling in the thick underbrush about 50 yards up the slope. I stayed perfectly still, my heart pounding so loud I was sure whatever was there could hear it. The rustling continued, moving slowly parallel to my position, never coming closer, but never moving away either. Then I caught a glimpse of something through the trees, just for a second, a patch of dark reddish-brown hair, higher up than a bear would be. I raised my camera instinctively, but couldn't focus in time before it was gone. The woods fell silent again. That same unnatural silence from my first experience years ago. No birds, no insects, nothing. Just the sound of my own breathing and the occasional breeze through the pines. I sat there for another 3 hours, completely motionless except to occasionally sip water. The sun was starting to dip below the ridge when I heard the first wood knock, a sharp, deliberate sound about 100 yards to my left. Then another from behind me, and a third from further up the ridge. They were surrounding me. I should have been terrified, but strangely I wasn't. It didn't feel threatening. It felt like I was being observed, evaluated. I slowly raised my hand and knocked twice against the small log beside me. The response was 5 rapid knocks from directly ahead, maybe 75 yards away. I knocked 3 times. 7 knocks came back. This continued for nearly 20 minutes. Me knocking, them responding with a different number of knocks, like some primitive form of communication. As darkness approached, I knew I needed to leave. I stood slowly, gathered my things, and said out loud, "I'm leaving now, I'll come back next week." I felt ridiculous talking to the forest, but it seemed like the respectful thing to do. I'd taken maybe 10 steps down the trail when a rock landed on the path about 20 feet ahead of me, not thrown forcefully, just tossed onto the path. It wasn't a rock fall. There were no cliffs nearby. Someone, something, had deliberately placed it there as I was leaving. I picked it up. It was an ordinary river stone, smooth and oblong, about the size of my palm. I still have it on my desk as I write this. The following week, I returned as promised. This time, I brought a small offering, a bag of apples and a jar of peanut butter. I'd read that researchers sometimes leave food to build trust with wary animals. I left them at the base of a large pine tree near my usual sitting spot, then moved about 50 yards away and waited. Nothing happened for hours. I was beginning to think I'd wasted my time when I heard heavy footsteps, deliberate bipedal footsteps, approaching the tree from the opposite side, hidden from my view by the thick trunk and surrounding brush. I held my breath. The footsteps stopped at the tree. I heard what sounded like the rustle of the paper bag, then more footsteps quickly retreating into the forest. When I finally worked up the courage to check, the apples and peanut butter were gone. This continued throughout the summer, me leaving small offerings, them taking them after I moved away. I never got another clear glimpse like that patch of reddish-brown hair. but the interactions became more frequent. Wood knocks, occasional whoops, stones placed on the trail. Then came September 12th, 2009. A day I'll never forget. I arrived at my usual spot around 3 in the afternoon. The air had that early fall crispness to it, and the forest was unusually quiet. I left my offering, this time apples and a candy bar, and sat down about 60 yards away. Almost immediately I felt something was different. The atmosphere had changed. The air felt heavier, charged somehow. That's when I heard it. Not from the distance, but from just behind the tree line directly in front of me, maybe 30 yards away. That same moan growl from years ago, but so much closer, so much more powerful that I felt it vibrate in my chest. I froze. Through the trees, I could make out a large, dark shape, moving slowly, deliberately. It was massive, at least 7 or 8 feet tall with broad shoulders. I couldn't see details, just this imposing silhouette shifting between the trees. I raised my camera with trembling hands and managed to snap 3 photos before it moved deeper into the forest. When I got home and checked the images, they showed only a dark blur between tree trunks. Tantalizing but inconclusive, like so much of this experience has been. But what happened next is why I'm finally sharing this story. As I sat there, still shaking from the sighting, I heard footsteps approaching from my right side. Heavy, deliberate steps crushing twigs and leaves. Whatever it was walking directly toward me, not trying to hide its approach. I should have run. Every instinct told me to get out of there, but I remained seated, clutching my backpack to my chest like some kind of shield. The footsteps stopped about 15 feet away, just behind a thick stand of undergrowth. I could hear breathing, deep, rhythmic breathing from something with enormous lung capacity. "Hello," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. The brush parted slightly, and that's when I saw it clearly for the first and only time. A face. Not human, but not entirely animal either. Broad, with a pronounced brow ridge, dark eyes that reflected intelligence, awareness. Our gazes met for maybe 3 seconds before it stepped back, letting the brush close again. I heard more footsteps, retreating this time, and within moments the woods erupted with those whooping calls from all directions. A cacophony of communication I couldn't begin to interpret. I sat there until well after dark, unable to move, trying to process what had just happened. When I finally made it back to my truck, I sat behind the wheel for nearly an hour before I felt steady enough to drive. I've never told this story until now. Who would believe me? I have no conclusive evidence, just blurry photos, some audio recordings of distant calls and knocks, and my own testimony. But I know what I saw. I know what's out there in the forests of Ferry County. I still go back occasionally, but the encounters have become less frequent since 2010. Sometimes I'll hear a distant wood knock or find my offerings taken, but never again have I had such a close encounter. Whatever these creatures are, they're intelligent, social, and cautious. They've been here long before us, adapting and surviving by staying hidden, and sometimes, for reasons I still don't understand, they choose to reveal themselves to people like me. Story 13. I've been debating whether to post this for years. Even now, I'm not sure if I should. My dad and I don't really talk about what happened that day in November 2016, but I can't stop thinking about it. I'm Daniel, 39 now, but I was 31 when this happened. My dad, Richard, has been hunting his whole life, taught me everything I know about tracking, shooting, and respecting the wilderness. He's the most level-headed person I know, which makes what happened all the more unsettling. We were deer hunting in the Methow Valley up in north-central Washington. It was our usual spot, a place we'd been coming to for years. The forest there is beautiful, mixed pine and fir with some clearings scattered throughout. There was a light dusting of snow on the ground that morning, maybe an inch or so, which was perfect for tracking. The temperature was probably in the high 30s, and the sky was overcast, but not threatening rain. We'd gotten to our spot before dawn, parked the truck at the logging road, and hiked about 2 miles in. The plan was to work our way along the ridge above the creek, where we'd had luck in previous seasons. We separated once we reached our hunting grounds. Standard procedure for us. Dad went left, I went right, about 60 yards apart, close enough to signal each other, but far enough that we could cover more ground. I remember checking my watch around 9:30 that morning. We'd been moving slowly for about 2 hours with no luck. The woods were quiet, too quiet, looking back on it now. Usually, you hear birds, squirrels, the occasional rustle of something moving through the underbrush. But that morning, there was just the sound of our boots crunching in the snow and our breath puffing out in little clouds. That's when I heard it, branches snapping behind us. Not the light snap of a deer moving carefully, but heavy breaks that sounded deliberate. I froze, my rifle ready, thinking we'd finally spooked something big. I glanced over toward where I knew Dad was, and I could see he'd heard it too. He'd stopped and was looking back in the direction of the sound. What happened next still gives me chills. About 40 yards behind us, at the edge of a small clearing, something stepped out from behind a cluster of firs. At first, my brain couldn't process what I was seeing. It was tall, way taller than any person I'd ever seen, maybe 7.5, 8 feet. It was standing fully upright on 2 legs, but this wasn't a bear. Its body was massive, covered in dark, matted hair that looked almost black in some places, brownish in others. The hair was longer in some areas, especially around the shoulders, but the face had less hair, showing darker skin underneath. The shoulders on this thing were unbelievable, almost too wide for the rest of its body, like a linebacker on steroids, but natural somehow. Its arms hung down much lower than a human's would, almost to its knees. I remember thinking how powerful it looked. Not fat, but solid, like it could tear a tree out by its roots if it wanted to. It just stood there, staring at us, not making any sudden movements, just watching. Then it made this sound, a deep, deep, rumbling grunt that seemed to come from its chest. It wasn't particularly loud, but in that quiet forest, it carried. That's when I realized there were 2 of them. While I was focused on the first one, Dad was looking elsewhere. He hissed at me, "Dan, on your right!" About 50 yards to my right was another one, partially obscured by trees, but clearly the same type of creature. It was moving parallel to us, making its way through the trees with surprising grace for something so big. I realized with a sickening feeling that they were flanking us. Dad signaled to me with a small gesture we use when hunting. Move back, slowly. We started backing up the slope, retracing our steps in the snow. The creatures didn't charge at us or make any aggressive moves, but they kept pace with us, 1 on each side, maintaining that same distance. They'd move when we moved, stop when we stopped. The most unnerving part was how quiet they were. Something that size should make noise moving through the forest, especially with all the underbrush and fallen branches. But aside from the occasional snap that seemed almost deliberate, they moved like ghosts. I could see branches moving, but there wasn't the crashing you'd expect. It was like they knew exactly where to place their feet. We kept backing up for what felt like forever, but was probably only about 20 minutes. Every time we tried to angle more directly toward where we'd parked the truck, one of them would shift position to cut us off, herding us in a different direction. Not aggressively, they never got closer than about 40 yards, but deliberately. My heart was pounding the whole time. I had my rifle, and I know Dad had his, but neither of us raised them. It wasn't just that we were shocked, it was something else. There was an intelligence behind those eyes. These weren't animals acting on instinct. They were making decisions, communicating somehow with each other, coordinating their movements. At one point, the one that had first shown itself stepped into another small clearing. It stood up even straighter, raising itself to its full height, and beat its chest once. Not like the gorilla chest pounding you see in movies, but a single solid thump with one hand. Then it made that deep grunting sound again. Dad and I exchanged a look. We'd both been hunting our whole lives. We knew what a warning looked like. We kept backing up, following our own tracks in the snow. After what seemed like an eternity, we made it back to the main trail leading to the truck. The creatures stayed with us the whole way, just out of clear sight now, but still there. Moving branches, occasional glimpses through the trees, that sense of being watched. Only when we reached the logging road where we'd parked did they finally stop following. We practically ran the last 100 yards to the truck. Dad fumbled with the keys. I'd never seen his hands shake before, and we got in. We sat there for a minute, not saying anything, just breathing hard and trying to process what had happened. Finally, Dad started the engine and we drove home. We barely spoke the whole drive back. What was there to say? We both knew what we'd seen, but it didn't make any sense. When we got home, Mom knew something was wrong right away. "No deer?" she asked. Dad just shook his head and went to put the rifles away. Later that night, we tried to talk about it, just the two of us out on the back porch. "Those weren't bears," I said. "No," Dad agreed. "Bears don't move like that." "What do you think they were?" He was quiet for a long time. My dad, who has an answer for everything, who knows every animal track and call in the Pacific Northwest, just shook his head. "I don't know, son, but they knew exactly what they were doing. That's what haunts me the most. Not just their size or appearance, but their behavior. They worked together to herd us out of their territory. They made their presence known when they could have easily remained hidden. They could have attacked if they wanted to. We were armed, but they had the advantage of surprise, size, and numbers. But they didn't. They escorted us out. I've gone back and forth about whether to tell this story. People who haven't experienced something like this won't believe it. I get that. If someone had told me this story before it happened, I probably wouldn't have believed them either. But I know what I saw. Dad and I haven't been back to that hunting spot since. We still hunt, but we stick to other areas now. Sometimes I think about going back, maybe with a camera this time. But then I remember the way that creature looked at me, the intelligence in its eyes, the deliberate way it moved, and I decide against it. Whatever those things were, they let us leave. I don't think we should push our luck. I still have nightmares sometimes. I'll be back in those woods, but in the dreams, I'm alone. The creatures are circling closer and closer, and I can't find my way out. I wake up in a cold sweat, the sound of that deep chest grunt still echoing in my ears. Dad's 68 now, still as tough as ever, but he never talks about that day. The only time he came close was last Christmas, when he'd had a few too many beers. He leaned over to me and said, "You know, those things could have torn us apart if they wanted to." Then he went quiet again, lost in thought. I don't know if what we saw were Sasquatch or Bigfoot or whatever you want to call them. All I know is they weren't any animal I've ever seen or heard of. They were something else entirely, something intelligent, purposeful, and absolutely terrifyingly real. And they're still out there, in those quiet woods, watching and waiting. Story 14. I'm still struggling to find the right words for what I saw that night in '77. I've kept it to myself mostly, except for telling my boyfriend at the time, and now sharing it here. It's not something I talk about casually, because people either think you're crazy or they get all weird about it. But after all these years, I still see those eyes when I close mine at night. It was late fall in 1977. Jeff and I had been dating for about 8 months, and we'd planned this weekend getaway to a lodge near Forks, Washington. Nothing fancy. Just a little cabin in the woods where we could hike during the day and cozy up by the fireplace at night. I was 23 then, working as a secretary at an insurance office in Seattle, and Jeff was 26, doing construction work. We both needed a break from the city. We'd both worked that Friday, so we couldn't leave Seattle until around 7 in the evening. Neither of us minded the night drive. Actually, we were looking forward to it. Less traffic, and the stars would be out over the Olympic Peninsula if the weather held. We caught the 8:15 ferry from Seattle to Kingston. The water was calm that night, almost glassy, and the moon made this silver path across the sound. It felt peaceful. God, I wish it had stayed that way. After we got off the ferry, we headed south on Highway 101. It must have been around 10 o'clock by then. The road was pretty empty. We'd see headlights maybe every 15 or 20 minutes, but mostly it was just us. Jeff was driving his '72 Chevy Nova, dark blue, with the heat cranked up because the car always ran cold. I remember I had this scratchy wool blanket over my legs and was sipping coffee from our thermos. We were making good time. The roads were dry and the night was clear, unusually clear for Washington in the fall. You could see every star overhead through the windshield, and the moon was bright enough that the fir trees on either side of the highway cast shadows. It must have been after midnight when we reached the stretch of highway that cuts through the national forest. Jeff had the radio on low, some classic rock station that kept fading in and out. I was getting sleepy, but I wanted to stay awake to keep him company. The headlights cut through the darkness ahead of us, and the yellow line in the middle of the road seemed to hypnotize me a bit. That's when I saw it. At first, it was just a shape on the right shoulder of the road, maybe 50 yards ahead. I thought it might be a deer or something, which wasn't unusual out there. As we got closer, though, I realized it wasn't a deer. It wasn't like any animal I recognized. "Jeff, slow down," I said, but the words came out as barely a whisper. He didn't hear me, or if he did, he thought I was just talking in my half-asleep state. As we got closer, I could make out more details in the headlights. This thing was standing upright on the shoulder. It wasn't tall, maybe 4 feet at most, but it was definitely standing on 2 legs. That's what got me first. The fact that it was standing like a person, but it wasn't a person, not even close. It had this thin, almost gaunt body. The proportions were all wrong. Its arms were too long for its body, hanging down past where its knees would be. Its legs were long too, but skinny, like twigs that shouldn't have been able to support even its small frame. The whole thing was covered in hair, long, shaggy brown hair that hung in matted clumps. Even its face, what I could see of it, was obscured by this hair. But the strangest thing was what it was doing. It wasn't running away or crossing the road. It was just standing there, waving its arms back and forth in front of its face, like it was trying to fan something away. We were going about 55 miles per hour, so this all happened in seconds. As we passed by, I turned my head to look directly at it through my passenger window. That's when it happened, when our eyes met. I'll never forget those eyes as long as I live. They weren't animal eyes, not exactly. They were set deep in that hair-covered face, and they reflected our headlights with a reddish glow, like a deer's would. But there was something else there. Something aware, intelligent. Like it knew exactly what it was looking at and what I was too. It was a knowing gaze. That's the only way I can describe it, like we recognized each other as thinking beings, even though we were nothing alike. It felt utterly foreign yet, somehow connected, not friendly, not threatening, just aware, conscious, present. The whole encounter lasted maybe 3 seconds total, then we were past it, and it was gone from view. I was frozen. Completely frozen. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my ears. My mouth went dry and my hands were clutching the blanket so tight my knuckles turned white. I wanted to tell Jeff to stop the car, but at the same time, I absolutely did not want to stop. I didn't want to see that thing again, especially not standing in our headlights on a deserted forest road after midnight. So I said nothing. I couldn't. The words wouldn't come. I just sat there, staring straight ahead, my mind racing with what I'd just seen. Was it a kid in a costume? No, no way. We were miles from anywhere, in the middle of the night. A deformed bear? Bears don't stand like that, don't have those proportions. Some kind of forest spirit or hallucination? I hadn't been drinking, wasn't on any medication. What I saw was real, physically present on that roadside. For the next hour of the drive, I couldn't speak. Jeff kept asking if I was okay, said I looked like I'd seen a ghost. I just nodded and said I was tired. The truth was, I was terrified to even say out loud what I'd seen, saying it would make it real, and I wasn't ready for that. We finally arrived at the lodge around 2 in the morning. It was this rustic place with individual cabins scattered among the trees. The main office was closed, but they'd left the key for us in a lockbox. Our cabin was small but cozy. Wooden walls, a stone fireplace, a kitchenette, and a bedroom with a queen bed covered in a patchwork quilt. Jeff built a fire while I sat on the edge of the bed, still in my coat. Once the flames were going and the cabin started to warm up, he sat next to me and put his arm around my shoulders. "All right. What's going on? You haven't said 10 words since we were on 101. I took a deep breath. The safety of the cabin, the warmth of the fire, his familiar presence. It all helped me find my voice again. "I saw something on the road back there," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "Something I can't explain." I told him everything. The small upright figure, the long arms, the hair, the eyes, how it had been waving its arms in front of its face, how its eyes had met mine with that unsettling intelligence. To his credit, Jeff didn't laugh or dismiss me. He looked concerned, worried about how shaken I was. "Could it have been a kid, or maybe a monkey that escaped from somewhere?" he suggested. I shook my head. "It wasn't a kid or a monkey, Jeff. It wasn't anything I've ever seen before." "Well, whatever it was, it's miles behind us now," he said, giving my shoulders a squeeze. "We're safe here." But I didn't feel safe. Not really. All night, I kept seeing those eyes in my mind. I barely slept, jumping at every creak of the cabin's wood or whisper of wind in the trees outside. What if it had followed us somehow? What if there were more of them in these woods? The next morning in daylight, things felt more normal. We hiked, we explored the area, we took pictures with my Kodak Instamatic, but I kept scanning the trees, jumping at shadows. That night, I made sure all the curtains were closed before dark. We stayed 2 more days, and nothing else happened. No more sightings, no strange noises. By the time we headed back to Seattle, taking a different route through Port Angeles, I'd almost convinced myself I'd imagined the whole thing, or at least exaggerated it in my mind. Years went by. Jeff and I broke up in '79. I moved on with my life, got a better job, eventually married someone else. I rarely thought about that night on Highway 101. Then, in the mid-'80s, I saw the Patterson-Gimlin film for the first time on some TV special about unexplained phenomena. My blood ran cold. The creature in that film, the way it moved, its proportions, the hair, it was larger than what I'd seen, but the similarity was unmistakable. I sat there in my living room, hands shaking as the realization hit me. Other people had seen something like what I saw. That's when I started wondering more about what had actually happened that night. Why had it been waving its arms like that? It took me years to come up with what seems like the most logical explanation. It was probably shielding its eyes from our headlights. Its eyes must be sensitive, adapted for night vision. Our bright lights would have been painful, blinding. I've never gone public with my story before now. What would be the point? I have no proof, no photos, nothing but my memory of those few seconds. But I know what I saw. I know those eyes looked into mine with recognition, with some form of consciousness I can't explain. Sometimes I wonder if anyone else has seen the same thing in that area, not the typical 8-foot Bigfoot that people report, but this smaller, thinner version. Was it a juvenile, a different species altogether? I'll probably never know. All I know for certain is that on a clear fall night in 1977, on a deserted stretch of Highway 101, I locked eyes with something that shouldn't exist. And despite all logic and reason, despite the years that have passed, I know it was real. Those knowing eyes haunt me to this day, reminding me that there are things in this world we still don't understand. And every time I'm driving on a dark, wooded road at night, I can't help but scan the shoulders, wondering if I'll ever see those eyes again. Anima, story 15 minutes, other accounts like mine. But January 2007 changed something in me, and I need to get this off my chest, even if most people won't believe it. My buddy Connor and I had been planning this backpacking trip through Ocala National Forest for ages. We're both experienced hikers, not the type to get spooked by normal forest sounds or mistake a bear for something else. I'd been camping since I was 12, and Connor was an Eagle Scout who'd spent more nights outdoors than most park rangers. We drove out early on a Friday morning, parked at a small lot near the trailhead, and hiked about 7 miles in. The weather was perfect, cool but not cold, typical January in Florida. The forest there is different from what people imagine when they think Florida. It's not swampy but dry, with sandy soil, tall pines, oak hammocks, and dense palmettos everywhere. We'd picked a remote area deliberately to avoid the weekend crowds at the more popular spots. By mid-afternoon, we found this perfect clearing about half a mile off the main trail. You had to push through a thick wall of palmetto to even see it existed. It was maybe 30 feet across, surrounded by live oaks draped with Spanish moss and a thick understory of saw palmetto. The ground was covered with pine needles, making it soft for sleeping. Perfect spot, or so we thought. We set up camp, gathered firewood, cooked dinner, and spent the evening talking about work and life while drinking the bourbon we'd packed in. Nothing unusual happened that first night. We heard the normal sounds: owls, the occasional rustling in the brush from small animals, distant coyotes once, typical forest stuff that any experienced camper recognizes. The second day, we hiked a 7-mile loop trail, saw some deer, a couple of gopher tortoises, and even spotted a bald eagle. We got back to camp, tired but feeling good. Made a fire, cooked the freeze-dried meals we'd brought, finished the bourbon, and turned in around 10. I remember checking my watch before zipping up my sleeping bag. I'm not sure what time it was when I woke up. My watch said a little after 1 in the morning. Something had pulled me from sleep, not suddenly but gradually, the way your brain sometimes alerts you to something wrong before you consciously register it. That's when I noticed the breathing. At first, I thought it was Connor. Maybe he was having a nightmare or something, but when I turned to look at him in our 2-person tent, I could see his eyes were open too. He was perfectly still, staring at me with this look I'll never forget, pure, primal fear. And I realized the breathing wasn't coming from inside the tent. It was coming from outside, maybe 15 or 20 feet away, deep, rhythmic breathing. Not fast like an animal that's been running or hunting. Slow, deliberate. Each breath lasted several seconds. In, out, and it was loud, loud enough to hear clearly through the nylon of our tent. Connor whispered, "Do you hear that?" So quietly I barely caught it. I nodded and reached for my flashlight, but he grabbed my arm and shook his head frantically. We just lay there, frozen, listening to whatever was out there breathing. Then the footsteps started, heavy, bipedal, the unmistakable sound of weight shifting from one foot to another. Not the scampering of a raccoon or the 4-beat pattern of a deer. 2 feet, walking slowly around the perimeter of our clearing. The breathing got louder, closer. I could feel each exhale in my chest, like when you're at a concert and the bass vibrates through you. My mouth went completely dry. My heart was pounding so hard, I was certain whatever was out there could hear it. Connor mouthed, "What the fuck?" at me, and I just shook my head. I had no explanation. That's when we heard a branch snap. Not the small crackle of twigs underfoot, but the sharp report of something substantial breaking, like when you take a thick stick and break it over your knee. Without speaking, we both moved to the tent opening. Connor unzipped it just enough to peer out. I positioned myself behind him, looking over his shoulder. The moon was nearly full that night, casting enough light to see the clearing. At first, I didn't see anything. Just shadows, trees, our backpacks leaning against a log near the cold fire pit. Then movement caught my eye at the edge of the clearing, where the palmettos grew thick. Two eyes reflected the moonlight, not green or yellow like most animals, red-orange, like embers from a dying fire, and they were high, much higher than a bear standing, maybe 6.5, 7 feet off the ground. The thing stepped forward, and I felt Connor's body tense against mine. Every hair on my body stood on end as it moved into a patch of moonlight filtering through the oak canopy. It was massive, broad shoulders, easily twice as wide as mine, and I'm not a small guy. The proportions were all wrong for a human, arms too long, hanging down almost to its knees. It walked fully upright, not hunched like a bear trying to stand. Its head sat strangely low, almost directly on its shoulders, without much of a neck, and it was covered in hair. Not fur exactly, but long, shaggy hair, dark brown or black in the moonlight. The face was hard to make out, shadowed and partially obscured by the hair, but I could see the outline of a broad, flat nose and a heavy brow ridge. The breathing was coming from this thing. Its chest expanded and contracted with each breath, visible even from our distance. The sound filled the clearing, drowning out everything else, the night insects, the distant hoots of owls, even the blood rushing in my ears. It took another step forward, and with one arm, casually like it was nothing, reached out and snapped a low-hanging oak branch. The crack echoed through the clearing. The branch was thick, at least 2 inches in diameter. It broke it like I would snap a pencil. Then it just stopped, stood completely still, staring directly at our tent, those eyes fixed on us, unblinking. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't even think. My mind was blank with terror for what felt like forever. Probably 30 seconds in reality. We stared at each other, us hidden mostly in the shadows of our tent, it standing in plain view, making no attempt to conceal itself. Almost like it wanted us to see it, to know it was there. Then, without any warning, it began backing away, slowly, deliberately, never turning its back to us. Those eyes stayed locked on our position until it reached the edge of the clearing. Then it simply turned and walked into the palmettos. We could hear it moving away, heavy footsteps crushing vegetation, branches moving aside. The sound gradually faded until the forest returned to its normal nighttime sounds, but neither of us moved for at least 10 minutes after it disappeared. When Connor finally turned to look at me, his face was ghost white in the moonlight. What the fuck was that?" he whispered, his voice cracking. I shook my head. I couldn't speak. My throat had closed up completely. We didn't sleep, not even for a minute. We sat back to back in the tent, flashlights in hand, jumping at every sound for the rest of the night. We didn't talk much. What was there to say? We both knew what we'd seen. Saying it out loud would make it real in a way neither of us was ready to face. As soon as the first gray light of dawn filtered through the trees, we packed up. No breakfast, no coffee, no small talk. We worked silently and efficiently, constantly scanning the tree line. Our fingers fumbled with tent poles and straps, clumsy with exhaustion and lingering fear. I kept dropping things, my hands shaking uncontrollably. The hike out was brutal. 7 miles normally wouldn't be much for us, but we practically ran the whole way, constantly looking over our shoulders. We didn't stop for water or rest. The backpacks that had felt manageable on the way in now seemed to weigh a ton, but adrenaline kept us moving. When we finally reached the car, I almost cried with relief. We threw our gear in the trunk, and I fumbled with the keys, dropping them twice before managing to get them in the ignition. As we pulled away, I caught Connor looking back at the trailhead, his face still pale and drawn. We drove for about 20 minutes before either of us spoke. Finally, Connor cleared his throat and said, "We're not telling anyone about this." I nodded. Who would believe us anyway? "It was a Sasquatch, wasn't it?" he said, his voice unnaturally calm. "A fucking Bigfoot in Florida." "I don't know what else it could have been," I replied. "Too big for a bear, wrong shape entirely, and it was on 2 legs the whole time." "The breathing," Connor said, staring straight ahead at the road. "I can't get the sound of that breathing out of my head." I knew exactly what he meant. Even now, months later, I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night thinking I can hear that deep, rhythmic breathing outside my window. I know it's just my mind playing tricks, but it doesn't make it any less terrifying. Connor and I don't talk about it much anymore. We've been on exactly 1 camping trip since then, at a crowded state park with cabins and facilities and families everywhere. We didn't even consider tents, and we've never been back to Ocala. I've spent hours researching Bigfoot sightings in Florida. Turns out there are quite a few, especially in the national forests. They call it the skunk ape down here. Before this happened, I would have laughed at those stories. Now I don't laugh anymore. I know how this sounds. I know most people reading this will think I'm making it up, or that we mistook something ordinary for something impossible. But Connor and I know what we saw. We know what was standing in that clearing, watching us with those glowing red-orange eyes. We know what snapped that oak branch like it was nothing. Sometimes I wonder if it would have hurt us if we'd made any sudden movements, if it was just curious about us, or if it was warning us to get out of its territory. I wonder if it's still there, moving silently through the palmettos, watching other hikers who have no idea what's sharing the forest with them. All I know for sure is that I'll never go back to find out. Story 16. I still get this sick feeling in my stomach whenever I drive that stretch of Highway 4 near Tofino. It's been over 7 years now, but I remember everything like it happened this morning. I've never posted about this online before. My buddies have heard bits and pieces, but I've never laid it all out. I don't know if writing this will help, but I need to get it off my chest. It was April 12th, 2016. Remember, because it was 2 days before my sister's birthday, and I was planning to drive to Nanaimo that weekend to see her. I was heading to a job site in Tofino, driving my work truck, a Ford F-250 with the company logo on the side. Nothing special, just a regular Tuesday morning commute. The weather was classic Vancouver Island, dark, misty rain that makes everything look like it's underwater. The kind of rain that doesn't pour, but just hangs in the air. My wipers were going at a steady pace, not frantic, but enough to keep the windshield clear. I had the radio on low, some morning talk show I wasn't really listening to. That section of Highway 4 is pretty remote. Lots of curves, tall trees right up to the road, and not much shoulder in most places. It was around 9:30 in the morning, and I hadn't passed another car for at least 15 minutes. The road was slick but not dangerous if you know what you're doing, and I'd driven it hundreds of times before. I was coming around this bend near Kennedy Creek. There's a small bridge there. I know that spot well because the corner tightens more than you expect, and I've seen people nearly go off the road there when they take it too fast. I always slow down a bit before hitting that curve. As I came around the bend, something caught my eye, maybe 100 feet ahead of me. At first, my brain tried to make sense of it. Maybe a deer or an elk crossing the road. But no, this was way bigger, and it was moving all wrong. There was this figure, massive, dark, and it was running across the highway incredibly fast. I mean, faster than a person should be able to move, especially something that size. The image is burned into my brain, this huge dark shape loping across the wet asphalt. Then it did something that made my blood turn to ice. This thing, whatever it was, jumped from the middle of the road all the way up the embankment on the right side in what looked like a single bound, not like several steps or scrambling up. One fucking jump. I instinctively hit the brakes. My truck slowed rapidly, and I felt the ABS kick in a bit on the wet road. I wasn't panicking yet, just confused, trying to process what I was seeing. As I rolled forward more slowly, I saw it standing there at the tree line, maybe 30 feet from the road up a steep bank. It was just standing there, completely still. Its back was to me, but I could make out its outline against the dark trees. This thing was enormous. The shoulders had to be at least 4 feet across, wider than any human I've ever seen. It stood maybe 8 feet tall, though it was hard to judge exactly from where I was. The whole body was covered in this thick hair, not fur exactly, but hair, mostly a reddish-brown color mixed with patches of black, especially on the back and shoulders. The rain was still falling, and I remember seeing drops hitting its back and rolling off. That detail has always stuck with me. The way the rain beaded on whatever this thing was. It seemed so real, so physical. I nearly stopped completely, my truck crawling forward at maybe 5 miles per hour. Part of me wanted to pull over and get a better look, but there was nowhere safe to stop on that corner. And honestly, another part of me was screaming to just get the hell out of there. The thing never turned around. It just stood there, motionless, like it was listening or waiting. Its head seemed proportionally small for its frame, kind of sitting low between those massive shoulders. There was something about the way it was standing, not like a bear on its hind legs, which I've seen before. This was different, more like a person, but wrong somehow. I kept driving, barely moving, staring at it for maybe 10 seconds that felt like an hour. Then the curve of the road took me past it, and I lost sight of it in my mirrors. My hands were shaking so bad I had to grip the wheel tighter. My first instinct was to floor it and get as far away as possible, but the road was too dangerous for that. I sped up to maybe 40 miles per hour, constantly checking my mirrors, half expecting to see it chasing after me. For the next 20 minutes, I just drove in a daze. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. A bear? No way. Bears don't move like that. A person in a costume? Out here in the rain, miles from anywhere? And no costume could explain that jump or the sheer size of the thing. The cell service on that stretch is non-existent. As soon as I hit a pocket of reception around 10:30, I pulled over at a small turnout and called my buddy Mike. He works for the forestry department and has spent more time in those woods than anyone I know. "Mike, you're not going to believe what I just saw," I said, my voice still shaky. "What's up, man? You sound freaked out." I think I just saw a Sasquatch or something, near Kennedy Creek." There was a pause on the line. I expected him to laugh, but he didn't. "Describe it," he said quietly. I told him everything. The size, the hair, the way it moved, that impossible jump. When I finished, Mike was quiet for a bit. Then he said, "You're not the first person to see something like that out there." That wasn't what I expected to hear. He told me there had been other reports over the years, logging crews, hunters, even a couple of tourists. Nobody ever got a clear photo, and most people didn't talk about it much because they didn't want to be labeled as crazy. I sat in my truck for a while after hanging up. The rain had picked up, drumming on the roof. I couldn't shake the image of that thing standing there, water rolling off its back. It felt too real to be my imagination. I continued to my job site, but I couldn't focus all day. My co-workers noticed something was off, but I just blamed it on lack of sleep. How do you tell people you think you saw Bigfoot without sounding completely insane? On the drive back that evening, I slowed down at that same spot, half hoping and half terrified I might see it again. But there was nothing there, just wet asphalt and dripping trees. Over the next few weeks, I did some research. I found reports of similar sightings in that general area going back decades. Vancouver Island apparently has a history of these things. Some people call them Sasquatch or Bigfoot. Others use local indigenous names for them. I even drove back out there on my day off, parked near that spot, when there was a proper pull-off. and walked around looking for tracks or hair or anything. I found nothing conclusive, just some broken branches high up where no human would reach, and what might have been a large footprint washed out by rain. The thing that still haunts me most isn't just what I saw, but how it made me feel. There was this overwhelming sense of being out of place, like I had stumbled onto something I wasn't supposed to see. The creature wasn't aggressive. It didn't charge my truck or even look at me, but its mere existence shattered something in my understanding of the world. I used to love hiking and camping. Since that day, I've only gone a handful of times, and never alone. When I'm in the woods now, especially as dusk approaches, I feel watched. Every snapping twig makes me freeze. Every shadowy shape between trees makes my heart race. I drive that stretch of Highway 4 differently now. I keep my eyes straight ahead, focused on the road. I don't look into the trees anymore. Sometimes I feel an urge to pull over at that spot, to look again, to confirm what I saw was real. But I never do. Was it a Sasquatch? I don't know. I don't have a better explanation. The way it moved wasn't human. The size wasn't human. But it wasn't exactly like the Bigfoot you see in those blurry photos or cheesy documentaries either. 7 years later, and I still don't know what to make of it. Some days I almost convince myself it was just a weird play of light and shadow in the rain, my mind filling in the blanks. But then I remember the way the rain beaded on its back, the impossible leap up the embankment, and I know what I saw was solid and real. I haven't seen it again, and part of me hopes I never do. But every time I round that corner near Kennedy Creek, I can't help but scan the tree line, just in case it's still there, standing motionless in the rain, waiting for something only it understands. Story 17. I've been trying to work up the courage to post this for a while now. My husband and I have kept quiet about what happened to us for years, but after hearing so many similar stories from other folks around our area, I think it's finally time to share what we saw. This happened about 7 years ago when we were driving home from a friend's house late at night. Even after all this time, I still get goosebumps thinking about it. My name is Maria and my husband is David. We live in Louisiana in a small town called Chauvin. That night, we'd been at a dinner party with some friends in Duluth, about 20 minutes away. It was getting late, around 1 in the morning, and we decided to head home. David had a couple beers, so I was driving. It was one of those hot, humid Louisiana nights where the air feels like a wet blanket, and a thick fog had rolled in from the swamp. If you're not familiar with this part of Louisiana, the road between Duluth and Chauvin isn't exactly a highway. It's this narrow, winding back road that cuts through dense swamp and forest. There's hardly any streetlights, barely any houses, just wilderness on both sides. During the day, it's beautiful in its own way, but at night, especially with fog, it can be downright creepy. The fog was so thick that night I had to slow down to about 30 miles per hour. Our headlights just bounced right back at us, and I could only see maybe 15 feet ahead. I remember having both hands gripped tight on the wheel, leaning forward like that would somehow help me see better. David was half asleep in the passenger seat. We were about halfway home when it happened. I still remember every detail like it was yesterday. I was focused on the road, squinting through the fog, when something huge moved in front of our car. It came from the right side of the road and crossed to the left in what seemed like 2 or 3 strides. I slammed on the brakes so hard that our seatbelts locked up. The car skidded a bit on the damp road before coming to a stop. "Jesus Christ," David shouted, fully awake now. What was that? I sat there frozen, hands still gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles were white. "Did you see it?" I whispered. "Something big," he said, leaning forward to look through the windshield. "Was it a deer?" But we both knew it wasn't a deer. We've lived in Louisiana our whole lives. We know what deer look like, how they move. This was something else entirely. Whatever crossed the road was massive, way bigger than a deer or even the wild hogs that sometimes roam around here. It was dark, covered in what looked like hair and had broad shoulders that almost seemed human-like, but the way it moved was what really got to me. Despite its size, it crossed the road with this incredible speed and agility, like nothing I'd ever seen before. The fog made it impossible to make out any clear details, but the silhouette is burned into my memory. It was tall, maybe 7 or 8 feet, and walked upright on 2 legs. Not hunched over like a bear might walk, but upright like a person. After a few moments of sitting there in shocked silence, David urged me to keep driving. "Let's get out of here," he said, his voice unusually tense. David's not the type to get spooked easily. He's an outdoorsman, spends a lot of time hunting and fishing in these swamps. But that night I could tell he was rattled. I put the car in drive and continued down the road, going even slower now, both of us scanning the trees and brush on either side. The fog seemed to get thicker, if that was even possible. The whole world had narrowed down to just what we could see in our headlights. About 3 miles further down the road, David suddenly grabbed my arm. "Look," he said, pointing toward the left side of the road. "Look at those eyes." At first, I didn't see anything. Then I noticed them. 2 glowing red eyes reflecting our headlights from the edge of the swamp. They were wide set, like they belonged to something with a large head. The eyes were positioned high off the ground, not low like you'd expect from most wildlife. They seemed to stare right at us with an intelligence that made my skin crawl. I slowed the car even more, almost to a crawl, and we both stared at those eyes. They didn't move or blink. They just watched us. Then, after what felt like an eternity, but was probably only seconds, they simply vanished, not like an animal turning away, but like someone closing a door, there one moment, gone the next. "What the hell was that?" I whispered. David didn't answer. He just kept staring at the spot where the eyes had been. The rest of the drive home was tense and silent. We were both scanning the road and the tree line, expecting to see those eyes again or that figure crossing our path. But we made it home without any further incidents. Once we got inside, we both started talking at once, trying to make sense of what we'd seen. We considered all the possibilities. Maybe it was a bear, though there aren't many in our specific area. Maybe a large person playing a prank at 1 a.m. in the middle of nowhere. Maybe our eyes were playing tricks on us in the fog. But deep down, we both knew what we saw was real and not something we could easily explain away. We decided not to tell anyone about it. This part of Louisiana is small-town country. People talk, and we didn't want to become those crazy Hendersons who think they saw a monster. So we kept it to ourselves and tried to forget about it, but I couldn't forget. For weeks afterward, I had trouble sleeping. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those red eyes staring at me from the darkness. I started having nightmares about being chased through the swamp by something I couldn't see but could feel getting closer and closer. David would have to shake me awake some nights because I was screaming in my sleep. Even worse, I couldn't bring myself to drive that road at night anymore. I'd make excuses to leave gatherings early so we could get home before dark, or take the much longer route that stuck to more populated areas. David never complained, though I know he thought I was being overly cautious. About a year after our experience, we were at a crawfish boil with some neighbors. The beer was flowing, and people started sharing ghost stories and local legends. That's when old Mr. Thibodeau, who's lived in the area his entire 70-plus years, started talking about something he called the Swamp Walker. According to him, there had been stories about a large, hairy creature in the swamps between Dulac and Chauvin for generations. Native Americans in the area had legends about it, and early French settlers had reported encounters too. Mr. Thibodeau claimed his own father had seen it back in the 1940s while out hunting. "It stands tall like a man," he said, "but it ain't no man, covered in dark hair, moves faster than anything that big should be able to move. And those eyes..." He shuddered, red like the devil's own. David and I exchanged looks across the table. We hadn't told anyone about what we saw, yet here was Mr. Thibodeau describing almost exactly what we'd experienced. That opened the floodgates. Over the next few years, we started cautiously asking around, and to our surprise, we found other people who had similar experiences. A fisherman who saw something large moving through the cypress trees, a teenager who heard strange, inhuman screams while camping, a woman who found enormous, human-like footprints near her backyard that bordered the swamp. The more stories we heard, the more convinced David became that what we had seen that night was a Bigfoot. He became almost obsessed with researching it, buying books about Bigfoot sightings across the country, joining online forums where people shared their experiences, even going to a couple of conferences where researchers presented evidence. I wasn't as convinced as he was at first. Growing up, Bigfoot was just something from cheesy TV shows or tabloid headlines. But the more I thought about what we saw, and the more similar accounts I heard from practical, level-headed people in our community, the harder it became to dismiss. The bayou areas of Louisiana would actually be perfect for these creatures to remain hidden. The swamps are vast and largely unexplored. There's abundant food, fish, deer, wild pigs. The climate is mild year-round, and the locals have a live-and-let-live attitude about the wilderness. People here respect the swamp and know it holds secrets. About 3 years after our encounter, David started going out into the swamp at night, hoping to see the creature again. I thought he was crazy and refused to go with him. He never saw anything as dramatic as what we experienced that foggy night, but he did come home one evening, visibly shaken. He'd heard something large moving through the brush, breaking branches that would require significant strength to snap. Then he heard a vocalization that he said wasn't like any animal he knew, a cross between a howl and a scream that echoed through the trees. That was enough for David. He stopped his night expeditions after that. We still drive that road between Dulac and Chauvin, though I still avoid it at night when possible. Every time we pass the spot where we saw the creature cross, I get a chill down my spine. Sometimes I think I can feel something watching us from the dense trees that line the road. I don't know if what we saw was actually a Bigfoot. I can't prove it, and I don't expect everyone to believe our story, but I know what we experienced was real. Something large, powerful, and intelligent crossed that road in front of us and watched us with those eerie red eyes, something that shouldn't exist according to science, but seems to anyway. Just last month, a cousin of mine who doesn't know anything about our experience was driving that same road late at night. He called David the next day, sounding freaked out, saying he'd seen something big dart across the road in front of him. He described it almost exactly as we remembered it. So if you're ever driving through the bayou country of southern Louisiana late at night, especially when the fog rolls in from the swamp, keep your eyes on the road and your hands steady on the wheel. And if you see a pair of red eyes watching you from the darkness, or a large figure crossing the road ahead, well, now you know you're not the only one. I still don't have answers about what we saw that night. I probably never will. But whatever it was, it's still out there in those swamps, watching and waiting. And sometimes when the house is quiet and I'm alone with my thoughts, I swear I can feel those red eyes staring at me through the darkness, across the miles, remembering me just as clearly as I remember them. Story 18. I still struggle to make sense of what I saw that afternoon in Prince Rupert. I've worked as a forestry technician for 8 years now, spent thousands of hours in remote wilderness areas, and nothing has ever shaken me like this. I know what I saw, though I wish I didn't. It happened 3 weeks ago. I was doing a routine inspection of a completed spacing project in an old cut block from the 70s. The area was about 20 kilometers from the nearest access road, pretty remote even by BC standards. My supervisor had dropped me off by float plane that morning at a small inlet, and I'd hiked inland to check the forestry work. The weather was typical for northern BC in autumn, overcast, cool, with that constant dampness hanging in the air. The inspection itself was straightforward. The spacing contractors had done good work thinning out the dense second-growth timber to give the remaining trees room to grow properly. I spent most of the day taking measurements, recording data, and photographing the site. Around 4 in the afternoon, I was walking back along an old logging road toward the beach where my pickup was scheduled. The light was already starting to fade a bit through the clouds. Anyone who's spent time in these coastal forests knows how quickly they can turn from merely gloomy to downright dark under the thick canopy. I'd been in these situations hundreds of times before. I'm comfortable in the backcountry. I know what bears sound like moving through brush. I can identify the rustling of deer or the occasional wolf passing nearby. This was different. It started with that feeling, that unmistakable sensation of being watched. If you've ever experienced it, you know exactly what I mean. The hair on my arms stood up and I felt a cold wave wash over me. Despite having hiked uphill for the last 20 minutes, I stopped and listened. Nothing. Just the sound of wind in the treetops and distant gulls calling from the coast. But that feeling didn't subside. If anything, it intensified. Working in forestry, you develop instincts about your surroundings. Those instincts were screaming at me. I slowly turned around, scanning the forest edge along the old road. That's when I saw it. About 50 meters back, partially obscured by a young hemlock, stood something I still struggle to describe without sounding crazy. It was tall, at least 7 feet, maybe more. Dark brown, covered in thick, matted fur. But it wasn't a bear. I've encountered dozens of bears throughout my career, and this was nothing like that. Its proportions were all wrong. The arms were unnaturally long, hanging well past where knees would be, and it was standing upright, but not like a bear does when it's curious. This thing was watching me deliberately, its posture almost human-like, but somehow wrong. For maybe 3 seconds, we just stared at each other. I couldn't make out its face clearly from that distance, and I'm grateful for that. What I could see was enough to send my heart racing so hard I thought it might burst. Then it moved. God, the way it moved. It took 2 massive strides, just 2, covering what must have been 15 meters in a blink, then disappeared behind a large boulder beside the road. The speed was impossible. It moved in this odd, bent-knee gait, almost crouched but covering ground faster than any human could sprint. I stood frozen, clutching my radio, though I didn't call anyone. Who would I call? What would I say? My hand went to my bear mace instead, pulling it from its holster on my belt, a laughable defense against whatever I'd just seen, but it was all I had. Logic tried to reassert itself, a bear standing unusually, some kind of optical illusion caused by the fading light. But I've spent my entire adult life in these forests. I know what bears look like, how they move. This was something else entirely. I started walking backward for several steps, unwilling to turn my back toward where the creature had disappeared. When I finally did turn around, I walked faster than before, frequently glancing over my shoulder. The feeling of being watched never left, even when the boulder and that section of road were far behind me. About 1 kilometer from the beach, I heard it. A sound I've replayed in my head countless times since. A low, resonant vocalization that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Not quite a growl, not quite a moan, but something in between that lasted maybe 4 seconds. It wasn't a sound made by any animal I recognized. And working forestry in BC, I've heard them all. I broke into a run then, no longer caring about looking professional or rational. All I wanted was to get to that beach, to open water, to the float plane that would take me away from there. I reached the rocky shore 20 minutes before my scheduled pickup, out of breath and trembling. The inlet looked peaceful, normal. Small waves lapping at the shore, a few gulls circling overhead. I used my radio to contact the pilot, asking if he could come early. Thankfully, he was already in the air and could divert to get me. While waiting, I stood in the open. scanning the tree line constantly. That feeling of being observed hadn't diminished. If anything, it felt more intense in the open space of the shoreline. I kept my bear mace in hand, though I knew it was probably useless. The most unsettling part was the silence. The forest behind me had gone completely quiet. No bird calls, no small animals rustling in the underbrush. Anyone who works in nature knows that unnatural silence is a warning sign. Something had disrupted the normal rhythm of the forest. When I finally heard the plane approaching, the relief was so intense, I nearly collapsed. The pilot, Dave, must have seen something in my expression when he taxied up, because his first words were, "You okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." I mumbled something about not feeling well, possibly coming down with something. I couldn't bring myself to tell him what I'd seen. Not yet. I needed time to process it, to convince myself I hadn't imagined it. On the flight back, I kept replaying those few seconds in my mind, the height of the creature, the impossible length of its arms, the way it moved. God, that movement. 2 strides covering what would take me 10 or 12, and that gait bent at the knees, but somehow fluid, powerful. Back at the office, my supervisor noticed something was off. When he pressed me about it, I finally broke down and told him everything. To his credit, he didn't laugh or dismiss me outright. Instead, he shared something that made my blood run cold. Apparently, 2 fishermen had reported seeing something similar on Banks Island after being stranded during a storm back in 1993. Their description matched what I'd seen: the height, the long arms, the unnatural gait. In the days that followed, I tried to rationalize what happened. I researched known wildlife in the region, unusual bear behaviors, even potential psychological effects of working alone in remote areas. Nothing fit. I know bears. I know moose, elk, and every other large mammal in these forests. What I saw wasn't any of them. I've gone back and forth on whether to file an official report. The Forestry Service doesn't exactly have a checkbox for possible Sasquatch encounter. And I'm not looking to become the office joke or have this follow me throughout my career. But I know what I saw. It wasn't a bear standing upright. It wasn't a moose with strange proportions in the fading light. It was something else. Something that moved with intelligence and purpose. Something that watched me with what felt like calculated interest. I'm scheduled to return to that same area next month for follow-up work. I've requested to be paired with another technician, citing safety concerns without elaboration. My supervisor approved it without question. I think he understands more than he's willing to admit. Sometimes at night I still hear that sound, that low, resonant vocalization that seemed to vibrate through the trees themselves, and I feel that sensation of being watched, even in the safety of my apartment. I don't know what to call what I saw in those woods. Sasquatch, Bigfoot, something else entirely. The name doesn't matter. What matters is that there's something out there in the remote forests of northern BC that doesn't appear in any wildlife manual. Something that watches and follows with a purpose I can't begin to understand. I've been in those forests my entire working life, and I thought I knew them. Now I realize I don't know them at all. And the worst part? I have to go back. This is my job, my livelihood. But I'll never walk those logging roads the same way again. I'll never shake the feeling that just beyond the tree line, something is watching. Something that can cover ground faster than I can run. Something that makes even the birds fall silent. 3 weeks later, and I still check over my shoulder when I'm alone. I still wake up at night thinking I heard that sound again. And I still haven't found a rational explanation for what I saw that afternoon on that old logging road in the cut block. I don't think I ever will.